Why did I do that? Why did I do that? Why did I do that? Thera kept asking herself as she ran away, feeling all but horrified that she'd almost kissed Ben, only going to his cheek at the last minute, while being completely wrong about her reason for doing it. It also wasn't as if she didn't know why she'd done it. Not really. As much as she wanted to deny the fact, she'd moved because whether she liked it or not, she wanted to kiss him, and it was growing harder and harder to tell herself she didn't. As much as she hated it, it was growing all the harder to say she just wanted him as a friend. Eventually, when she couldn't run any longer, she stopped, taking a seat on the steps of a church that had closed up for the day and placing her head in her arms as she caught her breath. She didn't know what to do, so she'd simply tried to escape from her problem, not wanting to face it, but she wasn't given the peace as Steph came up beside her. Sorry, me and Amy didn't think about how that might have sounded. We should have told you more, she said as she took a seat beside her, waiting for a response that didn't come. Do you want to talk at all? She asked, trying again and getting the same result before giving in to the question she really wanted to know. You love Ben, don't you? I don't want to love Ben, Thera almost shouted, all of it coming out as if a dam had burst. He makes me happy, and he's kind, and he tries so hard for me, Steph, but he's going to die centuries before me. I don't know how my dad or my aunt make it work, but I can't. I can't imagine watching someone I love slowly age and decay as I stay the same. No matter what her parents said, no matter what her Aunt Lux said, it always came back to this, and she still didn't know how she was supposed to handle the thought. Even after Ben had awakened his skill, the difference would be a blip in her lifespan, made all the worse if she awakened any of her own. While he got a few extra decades out of this, she was certain to get centuries, maybe millennia. Even if she stopped training her magic now, Ben could never come up to her level even if he managed to awaken a dozen skills because of the diminishing returns that would come with each one. Steph just sat beside her calmly, listening to the outburst in silence as she took it all in, trying to listen and support the best she could until Thera fell silent again. I know that's your big concern, but Thera, like it or not, Ben isn't going to age and die anyway. The only thing you can change is what you do while he's around. I know that. It wasn't a shocking revelation or anything. She didn't want her lifespan to keep her from enjoying things like friendships, even if they were all destined to be comparatively brief, but bringing romance into the mix made it feel different. If she could just put her feelings to the side, she thought she'd be able to spend whatever years she had with him happily enough, able to see him off with a smile in the end, along with whatever family he'd made for himself in that time. But she hated that thought too. She didn't want him growing old, and she definitely didn't want him starting a family with someone else, but that just made her feel worse. She didn't want to date him so she wouldn't be hurt in the end, but she didn't want him dating someone else because she couldn't imagine herself being okay with that either. I really am terrible. I just need him to find someone and deal with it without being weird. It will be fine eventually. Even as she thought that, though, she couldn't keep one last thought from slipping out. Besides, it's not like it's guaranteed he's interested. No, he definitely is. You don't know that. I do because he told Will the other day. Should you have told me that? I don't know, Steph shrugged. But it seems like it would be better to have it out there for you to think about than not knowing for sure, no matter how obvious it might be. Just how happy hearing that made knowing what to do all the harder. But she knew she couldn't just do nothing. It would be shocking if Ben didn't want to know what was happening. But before anything else, she wanted to clear her head. All right, well, I don't think I'm going to be able to get out of this, so I'll talk to him in a bit. I just need to relax first. Want to take a walk with me? Steph happily agreed, and the two of them wandered down the darkened streets of the city. All the while, both of them quietly wondered just how things would work out. As she dropped Steph off at the gate, she could feel from the effects of the bind skill they shared that Ben wasn't at the embassy. But that was good news as far as she was concerned. Even after talking with Steph, she still didn't have a clue as to what to do about it. So instead decided to sleep on it for the night, hoping some sort of choice would present itself in the morning. Unfortunately, as she laid down to rest, she found her thoughts were still a mess and left her unable to sleep as her mind spun in circles, with only two options coming to her thoughts no matter how much she struggled with it. Either she could try and push away any affection that was there, or she could give in to what she found herself wanting and tell him how she felt and see what would come of it. An uncomfortably tempting option despite her years of not wanting to get involved with such things, and all the more so for knowing he felt the same. It was as the early rays of the sun began to sneak their way through the window and she realized she hadn't slept a wink that she gave in and got up, off to find him after he didn't return for the night. I know he doesn't sleep a ton as is, but he really should have come back eventually. What could he have spent all night doing? A part of her wondered if he'd gone through the gate to somewhere else. It would have made more sense to her. But as she walked she found she was going in the wrong direction and continued on until a familiar tower filled her sight. Okay, that makes sense. He didn't get the chance to look at it as much as he'd originally planned. Of course he's using it to distract himself. As she found herself at the dead god's trial she felt him at the other side of it and started walking around after only a moment's hesitation, feeling the directions of their connection change as it did, leaving her wondering if he was moving to see her as well. But as she stopped so did he, leaving her to walk again. Each time she moved she felt the direction he was going change too, and each time she stopped so did he. First it was a little annoying. She had spent all night worrying about what had happened, how to talk to him and what she should do about her feelings. But as time went on and she circled the building things clicked. Wait, no, that's impossible, she thought in a panic before breaking into a run, going around the building multiple times and feeling something that couldn't be happening. Her skill kept pointing her towards the other side of the building, and even after awakening his skill, Ben wouldn't be fast enough to keep that pace without her catching up, meaning that she wasn't actually being pointed to the other side of the building. She was being pointed to its center. It felt like her heart was being squeezed in a vice as she ran all the faster, growing more ragged and desperate by the second, hoping that she was wrong, that he'd made something that was letting him move faster and was playing some stupid joke as the few others who were up and around the city cast her curious looks, the guard stationed outside seeming more annoyed than anything until she broke down and screamed into the sky. Myriad! Myriad, answer me, you stupid cube! Why is Ben in there? She hadn't forgotten what her uncle had said. It wasn't just a trial, it was a trial nobody had survived. It didn't matter how often Ben seemed to throw himself into danger, nor how curious he was about the magic on it. He wouldn't have just gone inside. It was only after a few moments of silence with no response from the god that she yelled out again, feeling panicked and desperate as she did. Myriad, I know you don't have enough believers to ignore anyone calling for you, so answer me or so help me, I'll burn down your forest, destroy your church, and dedicate myself to making you lose every believer you have. Why is Ben in there? Said the voice of a very different god from the one she called for as Analia spoke in her head, leaving her to try and fail to calm down. So you can get him out? She asked, feeling only a moment of relief as the silence stretched on. She thought she was going to be sick as she looked back at the tower with more and more eyes on her from her screams. Ben was trapped in there, and there was nothing even the gods could do but leave him stuck in all but certain death. How did this happen? Analia, please just tell me, she begged. Please just let me know what happened. As Olip woke the day after the competition, he'd gotten confirmation that the annoyance he'd had to deal with had been properly taken care of the usual way, and he couldn't help but celebrate with an early drink. Really, what's his name should have just agreed to it, or at least had the tact to be well-mannered in his rejection. The humiliation, honestly. But then if he won't work for me, this is better anyway. It's ridiculous how hard it is to get someone with an awakened crafting type skill. Don't any of those idiots know what an honor it would be to put their talents to use for the most important city in the world? A part of the man couldn't help but feel extra vindictive about it too. He'd been rejected by Falk often enough that he couldn't help but take some of it out on the boy as he dealt with him. Perhaps it would have been preferable to simply ruin the boy's career, but that was all but impossible with an awakened skill holder. No, it was better for him to be dead, else Olip would never feel content. Admittedly, doing it so soon may have been rash, but if he left the city it would only become harder, and he was sure that the group he usually assigned to it couldn't be traced back to him. At the very least, any time he'd dealt with a problem like that in the past had been fine. Tossing someone in the dead god's trial was the perfect means of disposal. In all the millennia it had been on the world, nobody had ever left it, meaning not only was it a perfect way to get rid of an annoyance, it ensured the body was never found. Honestly, I can only imagine how many others have used it the same way in the past. He thought with a laugh before beginning to move on with his day. While most of his tasks could be delegated, there were still a handful of things he had to do as the head of the political side of All Faith. But at the very least most of it could be done in the comfort of his mansion with his servants around to ensure his needs were met. At least that was how it usually went. As he took a seat on a cushion, getting himself relaxed as he did, the sounds of demolition could suddenly be heard all too close, making him jolt upright and call out to his staff. What the bloody hell is happening? None around had any idea. It was only as a group of his hired guards came rushing in that he was able to find out just what was going on. We've got 2 mages attacking, sir. We've lost the dining room and a few others in the surrounding area to the first strike, and the rest of the guards are already down. We need to get you out of here. He could barely process what he was being told. His guards were far from incompetent. He'd only hired the best to ensure his safety and was making sure to pay them well. The very idea that only 2 mages could do something like that without being stopped was ludicrous, let alone the fact that they would. Did they really think that they'd be able to get away with this? He wouldn't even have to dispose of them like any other pest. If they weren't killed as they were being stopped, they would be executed without question. It was those moments of shock that brought his chances of escape to zero, though. As he took his first steps towards his guards, ready to rush to leave the front and back of the room, he was and simply disappeared with a gush of air. Ollop was barely able to process the giant boulder that shot by him as he caught sight of the 2 who had caused such destruction. One he thought he recognized, a cloaked figure he was sure had been present during the contest, and the other he knew he did as he yelled out, "You think you'll get away with this, Falk, you bastard? I'll have your head." He motioned his guards to attack, but before a move could be made by them, the Yeti attacked first, a gray-black mana pouring from him and leaving those around him instantly incapacitated. Not only the guards, but his other staff collapsed on the ground in an instant. Only he was still standing and making him aware of just how desperate the situation might be for him. Wasn't he just a smith? All right. Stop this nonsense now and we can sort this out," Ollop commanded, showing none of the fear he was feeling as Falk stayed silent. The rage on the Yeti's face was clear for all to see, and his bloodlust poured from him. Seeing in the Yeti's eyes that there'd be no negotiating, and with nothing else he could think to do, Ollop tried to run. He just needed to hold out long enough for the city's Templars to arrive. As the religious capital of the world, there was plenty, and a disturbance like this wouldn't go unnoticed. But before he made it more than a step, the man was on him, and with the tremendous strength that came from both his race, as well as having awakened skills and years of training to increase his attributes, he grabbed Ollop's arm with one hand and his shoulder with the other, and began to pull. The scream that erupted from Ollop's throat left it raw, but he couldn't even notice it compared to the pain of his flesh tearing and bones breaking as his arm was ripped from his body. Blood poured out of him in a flood as he watched in horror at the damage that had been done in an instant. The pain left him on the verge of passing out, and he didn't understand why he wasn't as Falk swing his severed arm at his face, using enough force to crack his beak and bring him to the ground, hitting him again and again as the other failed to be mercifully knocked out. The reason for that becoming apparent as he briefly lost vision in one of his eyes, only to regain it and focus on the other mage there and realizing what they were doing. "They're healing me," he thought in despair. It was clear there were no good intentions in the act. It was to prolong his suffering to the greatest degree they could, denying him the mercy of his mind fading as they worked to kill him. His bones broke and they were carelessly re-healed in whatever odd angle they had bent in. His bleeding was always stopped enough to keep him conscious, and his body was made to cannibalize itself to make up for what was lost. And cruelest of all, any injuries to his brain were treated with a level of care to ensure he remained perfectly aware of everything that was happening. It was only when he was certain that he was going to die that he felt a glimmer of hope as he caught sight of a crowd standing outside of the hole in his wall. Clad in armor with weapons drawn, 100 Templars were there and at the ready, with someone even more dangerous than all of them combined standing at the front. The non-affinitied mage Vasta was with them, giving him the faith he would live and thinking of how the 2 before him would be forced to suffer for their acts before he ended their lives. It wasn't just him that noticed either. Both Falk and the hooded mage with him turned to acknowledge the group for the briefest of seconds before they continued on the endless beating and healing, not caring in the slightest about the crowd behind them. "Contender Falk enough?" Vutz told him, seeming more exhausted than anything else as she saw the scene before her and getting the Yeti to pause as he answered. This man is going to die, and if you know enough to know I'm a contender, then you know that you can't stop me, so back the fuck off. Please help. Alap tried to beg through his shattered beak, having no issue with sounding desperate. The extreme pain that filled him made it impossible to hide. These maniacs broke in and killed my staff. They've been torturing me since. You have to do something. Please, the rest of the folks here may be a bit low on vitality, but they'll live, he said with a sneer as he gave the downed man a powerful kick, throwing him against a wall as he did. I'm sure you wish you were so lucky. Fuck, Vasta yelled, ignoring the exchange. He is going to die for this, so step back and let us handle it. What? He thought he must have misheard. There was no way that was what she just said. But as she looked to where he laid as if she was seeing dirt, Vasta made her proclamation. Alap, for the murder of the apostle of the god Myriad, you are to be sentenced to death, along with the associates you'd worked with in the act. I'd say not to resist and accept your fate quietly, but it doesn't look like you could even if you wanted to. What? Are you insane? I haven't killed an apostle. Even for all the work he did in all faith, the gods didn't have their eyes on him. Crime wouldn't exist if they were all-knowing, but attacking an apostle would change that instantly. All of his less than scrupulous activities would immediately be investigated, and he enjoyed his quality of life far too much to ever consider such a thing. He could only feel his stomach drop as Vasta continued. As witnessed by Myriad, for having the apostle Ben Hef and the soundsmith Greed thrown into the dead god's trial, your fate is sealed. The investigation and interrogation of your associates has already been completed. All there is left is holding you until your date and means of execution are selected. That was his name, wasn't it? It was at that point that for the second time that day he was certain he would die. As her uncle dealt with the Templars after their attack on Alap, she'd left him to handle the aftermath. She had more important things to do. While watching the man slowly be broken down, it had managed to help her clear her mind. The panic and rage had subsided enough to make her realize there was something else she should have done before going to attack. She should have been helping Ben. A part of her thought about running to a church first. She'd managed to complete her job as she wove spell after spell of her life magic to ensure he'd regret what he'd done for whatever remained of his life. So she'd have to do it eventually. Changing her job was important, but compared to everything else it could wait. Every second counted, and she couldn't waste more than she already had as she rushed back to the trial, only to be confronted by the sight of the tower's door being encased in stone. Her father standing in front of it. How are you holding up, sweetheart? He asked, concern and sorrow filling his face as his question was completely ignored by her. Dad, take this down and get out of my way. I was hoping your mother wouldn't be right about this, he said with a sigh, before addressing his daughter more firmly. I'm not letting you go in there. Dad, I can't just leave him alone to die. Almost no trials will let a person meet up with a group they didn't go in with, and even if they did, I still wouldn't let you. I'm sorry, Thera. Hate me for it if you want, but I'm not going to let you kill yourself over this. Loss is something you're going to need to get used to eventually, whether you like it or not. Rely on the people in your life all you need to, but you have to do your best to handle it. I don't want to handle it. I want to be with him. Now get out of my way. She tried to fill the area with her mana, to rip apart the stone encasing the door and use more to knock her father aside. But nothing happened. Not a single stone so much as wiggled from her power as her father gave her a sad smile. Honey, this isn't training. I'm not going to hold back. As much as you've improved, you're not on my level. She didn't want to admit it and kept struggling to do anything. But her father was right. She couldn't use either her earth magic or telekinesis to do anything against him, and her life and dark magics would be all but useless as well. All she could do in the end was storm away, feeling powerless as she did. Angry, upset, hopeless. She was feeling all of that and more as she walked through the streets in a daze, knowing there was nothing she could do. Even if she was aware that her father was probably right, that if she were to throw herself into the trial, there was no guarantee she'd be able to do anything to help Ben, let alone actually meet up with him. She'd have still rather taken her chances and tried than to be out there as her friend was in mortal danger. What am I even supposed to do? If the gods can't help, then even praying is pointless. She thought bitterly as she looked up and realized she'd wandered to the city's craftsman guild without meaning to. Knowing she'd need to do it sooner than later, she walked in to make use of their job crystal. Ben always hated delaying it, finding waiting to be nothing but a waste of potential experience. And she couldn't argue the point, even if she wasn't remotely in the mood herself. Going to where it was kept and finding no line, she placed her hands on it, letting the options fill her mind as she did. Available jobs: Queen of Mana, Musician, Professional Dancer, Bard, Darkness Mage Charm Specialized, Healer, Telekinetic Mage, Dark Mage, Adventurer, a High Spirit Mage, a High Life Mage. As she listlessly looked them over, she didn't know which one to take. At that point, she barely cared. Thinking about what she wanted to work on and how she wanted to grow meant thinking about the future, something she couldn't stand at the moment. Thinking about it meant thinking about a potential future without Ben. No, he's not dead. I can still feel him, so I'm not going to be so negative. He's going to be okay like he always is. I'm sure he'll figure something out and get out of there in a few days, maybe a week. I just need to sit tight and be patient, so I need to actually think about what would be best for when I see him again. Thinking that didn't really make her feel better, nor did it leave her more hopeful, but it did help her narrow down her choices. At her last job, she hadn't taken High Spirit Mage, despite how helpful the first one was to her, so she could take Life Mage instead. Given the amount of injured there were during their Leviathan hunt, she had wanted to help, so that had seemed like the best choice. Now, though, there was a different reason not to take it. Her quest from Analia. She still really wanted to try to awaken her earth magic at the point where she would be able to awaken her life magic as well, but though it was exceedingly rare, there had been instances of a job awakening a skill in the past. Given her abnormally high affinity with earth magic, she didn't want to risk it happening before she was ready, so she would leave that option for once she was at the levels she wanted. She ignored her more performance-oriented jobs, as she always did, as well as adventurer for the time being, with that one all but pointless without her hunting partner there to help take advantage of it, leaving her with the healer job and her other magic jobs. Healer is just going to give me worse bonuses than High Life Mage, so not much point considering it right now. As for Telekinetic Mage and the Dark Mage jobs, no, they don't matter. I select High Life Mage. Name Thera Oris. Race: Succubus/Spirit Hybrid. Titles: Spirit Child. Jobs: High Life Mage LV5. Previous jobs: Beginner Dancer, Dancer, Apprentice Mage, Earth Mage, True Mage, High Earth Mage, Spirit Mage, Life Mage. Attributes: a Vitality 1070. A Vitality Recovery Rate 12 per hour.
Mana 261,329.
Mana Recovery Rate 57 per minute. Strength 128. Agility 374. Stamina 308. Intelligence 315. Affinities: a Light 4. Life 22. Fire 11. Water 14. Air 12. Earth 103. Death 3. Dark 43. Space 2. Time 1. Resistances: a Light 5. Life 9. Fire 11. Water 16. Air 12. Earth 35. Death 13. Dark 42. Space 7. Time 8. Blessed Skills: Earth Magic LV9. Charm Magic LV2. Passive Skills: World Speak Plus. Coordination LV3. A Medical Knowledge LV3. A Bind. Active Skills: Calculate LV1. Dance LV4. A String Instrument LV3. A Woodwind Instrument LV2. Cleaning LV1. Staff Wielder LV0. Meditation LV2. Speed Reading LV2. Life Magic LV8. Telekinesis LV2. Dark Magic LV1. Spirit Empowering LV2. Cooking LV0. Blessings: Analia's Blessing. Trials: Trial of Analia and Talona. She would have been able to feel incredibly satisfied as she looked at her card if Ben was at her side. With the spirits coming to her, getting her to provide them with mana so frequently had forced her to use more than she ever normally would, and the results had been great for both her total quantity, as well as her regen rate. It looked like her agility and stamina were both beginning to hit a wall, but that was expected enough. She wasn't doing much to train them recently, and for all the bonuses she had to them, it would be useless if they weren't used. Most important of all was the level to her life magic, something that had been wholly unexpected given how recently she'd just gotten the last, but that was something she could only be grateful for. The attack on Alap she and her uncle had done had not just been an excellent way to let out her rage and anger. It had also proven to be an excellent way to train. Something she decided she'd be putting into practice again immediately as she decided on her next move, going through the gate and walking into the Untamed Lands. As she'd been doing when she'd helped Ben in the woods, she used her earth magic to carry herself on a slab of dirt far into its depths, to the point she felt she didn't need to fear anyone else getting in her way as she got to work, tearing dirt and stone from the world and condensing it all into a thick dome that towered a few stories high. It hadn't been quick and it was plenty tiring, but it was important. For what she was going to do next, she needed to protect her back. Raising herself up to a ledge within it, safe from the reach of anything other than those with wings, she carefully removed her cloak, followed by her brace while at the same time stripping the charm from the dark mana within her to prepare for anything that would come. And with no part of her charm being suppressed, it was like a call had gone out through those dense woods. She waited only a few minutes before putting everything back on, but it had been enough. She could hear the sounds of footsteps pounding the dirt to rush to her, and as they drew closer she prepared her dark spell, firing it off as a stampede emerged. The creatures she saw were a mix of species, predators and prey, all desperate to get to her as she fired a dark spell she had no experience using before, all of her knowledge of it coming from the many books Ben owned. Bloodlust, a spell that drove creatures to madness, bringing them to fight and kill anything within their sight, and with the power she put behind it, all of them succumbed to an orgy of carnage as she watched from above. The spell was brutal to the point that when she'd first read of it, she had been surprised that it wasn't as difficult to find out about as any mental compulsion or mind control. But then, given the nature of dark magic, it really just came down to where different societies and nations saw fit to draw the line. It was a magic that weakened opponents and played with their very thoughts. It wouldn't surprise her if she learned there were places that banned its use altogether, but as with anything else it had its uses. With animals tearing each other apart before her, she put all of her knowledge into healing them all, keeping them in fighting shape as her mana went to knitting flesh back together, regenerating blood, reattaching limbs that were barely hanging on and bringing them back from the edge of death. Given the amount of mana she had at her disposal, her biggest struggle as she normally trained her life magic wasn't running out of mana, it was running out of patience. Or, at the very least, patience who wouldn't complain if her magic caused side effects in their bodies. She'd never been able to simply stop and let herself experiment with it as she did now, in ways she never could in the past for fear of how it might hurt someone. But for the creatures before her, that wasn't a worry. She'd never considered doing anything like this before. Even now as she watched, she couldn't deny it felt needlessly cruel. But she couldn't be picky. She wanted to raise her life magic again, not just for her quest, but out of her worry for Ben. She was going to tell herself that he would be fine, that he would get out and live, but that didn't mean he would escape without injuries, so being powerless to do anything else, she would train as hard as she could, raising her skill and job level to prepare. As she cast her spells, occasionally firing off another dark one to keep up the brutality and draw in any straggling creatures to the fight, she did her absolute best not to think of anything else to distract her from her misery. "Damn it all, where are we?" Greed swore. "I swear to any god that's listening, if this is one of my other bastards, I'm going into hiding after this." "How many do you even have?" Ben asked, the calmest one of his minds handling talking as the rest assessed the situation. They were in a large empty room, some sort of spatial effect on it giving it far more area than could be seen from outside the building, with a fountain and a table beside it at its center. The door they had gone through had vanished as it was pulled closed behind them, with a completely different one at the other side of the room, all but begging to be stepped through. More significant than that thought was the magic built into the structure, the enchantments that made the trial what it was. He wasn't certain what was happening, but he could already tell that certain sections of the enchantments were moving. It was a feature he couldn't be sure if it was present in the magic on Analia's trial. His level had been so much lower then, along with the quality of his mana sense, that for as much as he could see he was sure he'd missed even more. It was just one more thing he'd need to investigate, at least so long as he lived. At least 20, Greed told him offhandedly. But you won't catch me with more. Too many already want my neck for one reason or another. Kids are a death trap. Well, the good news for you at least is I'm pretty sure they were after me, though I have no freaking clue why. The bad news is we're in trouble. You know where we are. I was kind of distracted getting tossed in here. Enlighten me? The dead god's trial. Damn. Well, fair is fair. You already bought me a few extra days' legs. I won't hold this against you, the crab said, already uncomfortably resigned to his fate. He'd heard about the trial before, how nobody within it had survived. He understood just what it meant to be tossed within it. Ha! Well, I appreciate your understanding, Greed, but I'd rather live myself, so I'm going to try some things. I'm just going to need your help a bit. You think you can get us out of here? He asked in disbelief, getting a shrug in return. I think I'd rather try than wait it out. Nothing has happened yet, so hopefully we're good until we go through the door. For the time being, though, I need you to buff my mana and mana regen. The crab had blessing magic, basically an awakened combination of both light and life magic, meaning it was well suited for both healing and buffs. Ben hadn't forgotten how he and Thera had survived the final bit of Analia's trial, how he'd broken down the enchantment on one of the statues, and he had so many more advantages now than he'd had then. His understanding of enchantments was miles above where he'd had it before, along with his skills on a technical level. That plus the 11 minds in his head to speed up the process. He just needed to decipher whatever magic had made the door vanish, break it down, and let themselves out. As interesting as the structure around him was, and as much as he wanted to study it in greater detail, his first priority was surviving. Greed did as he was asked, leaving Ben to feel the power flowing through him. He was still getting used to the changes to his attributes that came with awakening his skill, but he wanted every boost he could get. Breaking down a god's enchantments the last time had been no easy feat. He didn't want to be stuck for hours breaking them one by one. He moved to the wall where the door had been when they were tossed through and began examining it in detail, hoping something would stand out to him as he did. Even though he'd only examined the unique enchantment structure of the trial once, he'd been thinking about it off and on with a few of his minds ever since, theory crafting and formulating ideas on how it might act. Ideas he wanted to test out sooner or later but hadn't been able to find the time with so much else going on. Combined with that was the new knowledge his 9th level enchanting gave him as he examined the wall. It wasn't giving the magic in levels, that probably wouldn't be an accurate way of presenting it anyway since the trial was made in a world without the system, but it acted as a guide at least, letting Ben confidently say that all 10 branches of affinity magic, as well as non-affinity mana, had all contributed to how it was made up. He carefully combed over it, trying to poke at it with his thoughts, not letting anything distract him as he fell into it and weighing what he was seeing against what he already understood, discarding some theories and creating new ones as the time ticked by, until at the end he gave in. His information would be too limited to truly understand for the time being if he wasn't going to spend days on it, so instead he decided he would just break the enchantment that looked the most important to see what would happen. He selected the one that had the most other rings of mana bound to it before he ran his own against it, trying to break it down and hoping something would unravel, or at the very least give him a greater understanding of how everything worked together, but as he did, nothing happened. He could do nothing to affect the enchantment. It felt like he was trying to knock down a wall by blowing on it. Oh, that is really not good. Why isn't this working? I guess in Analia I only tried it on the statues and not the outer wall of the trial. Could that have been made significantly sturdier? Or does this have something to do with the unique enchanting method I'm seeing here? Honestly, there's too much I don't know. I need to re-examine everything and figure it out from there. But first, he needed a break. He left the wall for the first time in hours, making Greed perk up as he did. Any luck? None yet. I figured I'd see if the fountain is safe or not. If they had no water then, they were on a time limit. But as Ben stood in front of the fountain, crystal clear water streaming from it, he couldn't help but want to take a sip. He did his best to be cautious as he reached his hand out to it, not certain that this wasn't a part of the trial that could leave him dead in an instant if he did something wrong. He felt the cool liquid reach his cupped fingers and brought it to his lips, giving it a taste as he did. That seems fine. That just leaves. He cast his eyes to the table at his side, seeing the square of what looked like bread placed on top of it, and carefully picked it up, only for a new one to suddenly appear in place of the old one after, almost making him drop what he held in surprise. Spatial magic, huh? I guess if it keeps us fed then that works for me. He grabbed the other one for greed, only for it to not be replaced, leaving him with even more questions. Was there a limit or a time limit? Did they get two because there were two of them, or was that how much it would always provide? He could only wait and see if another arrived after a while to take its place, but for the time being he cautiously took a bite. Alright, I guess. It didn't live up to the standards he had for his own cooking even remotely, but it would keep him alive, and feeling more confident it was safe, he handed the second piece to Greed, while at the same time blocking off the end of his amplifier to fill with water for him before handing it over. He watched the crab drink deeply as he thought. At the very least, his companion didn't need much in the way of food compared to him, and it looked like the race that originally would have participated in the trial would have been a similar size to Ben. At worst, if things got desperate, they could share the food. At least that was his thought before Greed took his first bite, immediately spitting it out, coughing and swearing as he did. What is it? What's wrong? Ben asked, grabbing him more water that was immediately swished around and spat out. Poison, he said as he cast healing spells on himself. This isn't looking great. Huh, legs? Ben carefully picked up Greed's bread and looked it over, taking care as he did. In every way it appeared the same as his, and he ever so cautiously took a bite as his companion watched at the ready, only for him to be fine. Looks like I can handle it at least. The question became why. Was it because his demon organs were helping with his poison immunity? The great life spirit had said they'd do as much. Could also be a simple incompatibility on Greed's part. Not every creature could eat everything. It was part of why potions were less popular than just using one of the healing magics. A food or potion to one person could be toxic to another. Whatever the reason though, they now had a new problem to deal with. If they didn't manage to get out, Greed would starve. Ben pinched the bridge of his nose as he took it in. He was still determined to get them out of there. It was only a matter of how long it would take. He was sure it was possible, it just wouldn't be easy, so he needed to know what sort of time limit he was on. Alright, how long can you live without food? Pretty sure my kind can manage about 3 weeks, but it won't be a happy 3, I can tell you that. So then our options are either me getting us out in the next 2, or else trying to complete the trial before you starve, Ben said with a sigh. I'll leave it up to you, man. What do you want to do? I still think I can get us out eventually, but who's to say if I can manage it in that time limit? Not to mention that if it doesn't hand out more food then, I think I'm on a tighter time frame than you are. The crab thought for a minute before letting out a groan. Between basically certain death trying to work our way through this stupid thing and starving while you see if you can get us out, I choose starving for now at least. Let's see how I feel in a couple days though. Sounds good. In that case, I guess I'm going to get back to it. Not sure if I can actually break any of the enchantments that make up this trial, but I might be able to lay my own to modify them. We'll see. With time of the essence, he saved the leftover food for later in case no more showed up and got to work, moving around the room to study the enchantments and trying to build a model in his mind of just what they did. This seems wrong. What's happening here? He'd spent 2 whole days looking everything over and experimenting as he went, trying to get an understanding of the trial as he did, but with minimal luck. While he was lucky at least that the trial seemed to provide those 2 pieces of food each day, Greed was less so as he struggled with the hunger gnawing within him. More important though was the change occurring within the magic of the trial, or at least the parts that seemed to be moving. There was a certain section he kept finding himself going back to, watching it change as the hours went on. It had started off as 4 rings of mana, but now it was down to a single one, the magic on it altering itself as the prior 4 had, and it was picking at his brain. I feel like I should know what's happening here. Should be obvious, what about it is screaming out to me? He'd gone over the entire room, and while there were other enchantments that seemed to be moving and changing on their own, these ones had stood out. He'd taken note of them after they lost their first ring, planning on checking them again after he looked at different sections a little longer in the hopes of seeing another change, with them being down to 2 by the time he'd decided that he should be devoting himself to that section. Since he hadn't had any luck with breaking the enchantments himself, he decided he should actually sit down and look it over, to see how they destroyed themselves. But that had been no help to him either. The ring had simply broken. There was no apparent reason that gave away what had occurred, unless of course there was some sort of kill switch within the enchantment itself, giving it a time limit. Wait, shit! A time limit? This is a countdown. It all snapped into place in his mind. The trial wasn't going to just let them sit there on their hands for weeks as he worked to figure out how to get out of there. This was meant to be a challenge from a god, and Ben could only doubt that it would be so kind as to just let him out once the last one broke. All of his minds were in a blaze as he compared the current structure of the ring to the previous one and felt his stomach sink. If it really was a countdown, then he had minutes to do something. He already knew he wasn't going to be able to break out in that time, but he was certain staying would be a death sentence, meaning there was really only one option. In a panic, he looked for Greed and ran to the small crab, scooping him up before he could explain anything and rushing to the door at the other end of the room as he felt something in the air change. The density of mana around them thickened in a way he felt validated his choice as he pushed his body to its limits in his sprint, throwing himself against the door and falling through it as a loud crash could be heard from behind him, into the unknown of the trial. The world briefly went black as they went to the other side, and a part of him wondered if he was too late, if the countdown he'd seen was for completing the trial as a whole, not just entering its starting line. But that fear changed to another as he found himself somewhere different. No solid ground beneath him. For a moment he hung suspended in a vast blue sky before he felt himself plummet. He didn't know how high up they were. There was no land to be seen beneath him, and it was possible he would be falling forever as he went, when suddenly he was assaulted by a gust of wind so powerful it knocked the air from his lungs as it struck. He held on to Greed for dear life, knowing if they were separated now they'd never be able to find each other again, as he was struck by another gust, and another after that, each throwing him in different directions before he eventually returned to his freefall. Each time he did his best to breathe. If he let himself fall unconscious as he kept having the air knocked from his lungs, then he was as good as dead, if he wasn't already. He couldn't even begin to guess the purpose of the trial he'd found himself in, and without understanding that, how was he supposed to get out of it? He did all he could to keep his wits about him, observing the surroundings the best he could and finding nothing. There was only himself and Greed in that infinite expanse. No light source to be seen despite how bright it all was. The only thing here is this freaking wind. He couldn't hear anything over the sound of it blowing and his freefall, and worse, as the time passed he was pretty sure it was only getting more powerful. It was as he felt himself being ragdolled about, his body feeling like it was going to break from the strain, that 2 different things showed up in the distance. A small glimmer of light in one direction, and a tornado in the other. He found a small, bleak part of him wondering if it would be better to call it a hurricane. He wasn't sure of the difference, but whatever it was, it looked like it meant his death if he got too close, so instead he tried to focus on the light in the distance. This thing has to have some sort of goal, right? Maybe it's getting there? It wasn't much to go off of, but it was better than nothing. The only question was how. It wasn't like he could fly. If he had air magic, then maybe he would have been able to do something, or even if he had telekinesis, there was hope. As things stood, though, he had a single magic skill he didn't have any idea how to even use, and the rest of the options on his status didn't seem like they'd get him anywhere. All that left was his mind's and what he could only assume would be a whole lot of suffering to get there as he stretched the power of his thoughts. He wouldn't describe his idea as good so much as he would call it desperate. With no real options, he roughly shoved Greed into his jacket pocket and zipped it closed, before unzipping his coat and holding both sides of it tightly, waiting for the next gust of wind to hit. Front. The wind blew at his face, pushing him in the wrong direction he wanted to go, and he did his best to make himself as small as he could until it passed, watching the light end up higher and higher above him as he plummeted. Up. He opened his jacket as wide as he could, catching more air to make him rise into the sky, feeling the strain on his limbs as he did. He wasn't certain of how long he'd been tossed around so far, but he was sure that as the power of everything kept increasing, eventually something would break. He just wanted to get there before that point. With every single gust that blew by him, he did his best to react as fast as he could, opening and closing his jacket, making himself as big or small as he needed to be and putting himself into different angles until he was finally close. Seeing a hole in space with a glowing edge, he could only think marked it as a door within his sight. As long as he kept up with the wind, he was sure he'd make it through eventually, but his time was up. He hadn't been looking at it, knowing that there was nothing he could do about the tornado behind him as it approached, but even without any violent wind tossing him about, he could feel himself being pulled in and took a quick look behind his shoulder, finding it all too close as he did. Damn it! Just a little more. Just one last push-up and over and I'm through. Come on! It wasn't much to hope for. He'd been tossed around by the whims of the wind since he stepped through the door. One more good breeze was all he needed, but when it came he was tossed into despair. It didn't throw him forward, but back, into the tornado. As he felt himself enter the wind's inescapable grasp, he could only be thankful that he was just being pulled around by the air. Unlike any windstorm on Earth, it wasn't filled with dust and debris as it tossed him around, but at the speeds his body was moving, that was a small consolation. He was growing lightheaded but doing his best to hold on to what few strands of consciousness he could when he glanced the smallest amount of luck as the tornado continued on forward, and in an act that made him think the universe wasn't ready to kill him off quite yet, tossed him through the hole in space to whatever was next for him. Going through the portal was as violent of an experience for him as the tornado, leaving him grateful to be alive, even if he was worse for wear. The speed he had been moving at left him rolling across the floor until he crashed into the wall at the other end, breaking his arms and legs as he went, and he was sure a few ribs too. His face felt wet from what was undoubtedly blood, but his first thought wasn't about his own pain, but the safety of the crabs secured in his pocket, which he forced himself to unzip, already afraid of what he might find. Legs! What the hell was that about? Greed yelled as he got out, looking no worse for wear and leaving Ben relieved. What happened to the plan? What dash? He only stopped as he got a good look at Ben. Seeing him broken and bleeding cut his complaints short. All right, let's get you to a state where you won't die on me, and then tell me what happened, he said as he began using his powerful healing spells, swearing as he did. Infinite hells. Why is this going so slowly? Ben personally thought it was going far faster than he was used to, but then, for a person with an awakened magic to have any difficulty, it was probably a surprise. God, I don't mind my resistances much, but having the effectiveness of healing spells cut by over 30% is still rough. Now that I think of it, was all of that powered by air magic? How freaking bad would that have been if I didn't have my resistances? He couldn't be certain given that Analia's trial seemed to circumvent them somehow. But with what he'd just gone through, he decided he would take whatever win he could. He was alive, that was all that mattered. After many hours, Greed had all of his more serious wounds treated and moved on to fixing his face, making it so Ben could explain what happened as he worked on the rest of the injuries. Damn it! The crab spat. Of course there was a time limit. So what now? Well, I thought I could get us out because we were at the entrance, but now I'm not sure. For all I know, we'd have to go through that again. But honestly, I vote no on that. Agreed. It was crap enough before you threw me in your pocket. So that just leaves us with one option then, he said as he got up and looked around. They were in a room nearly identical to the first one they'd been in before falling into that endless sky, with a fountain and table, as well as a door that he was sure to take him to some equally horrible place as the last. There was just one difference he could see. Along one wall was a pile of discarded items. There must have been hundreds sitting there, and he could only worry about what that might mean for whatever was coming next. But the thought was broken off by Greed. The problem is, that last option means I'm either dying in the trial or dying as I starve. Not really a fan of either. Give me some time to think. I need to check how long we have first. He went along the wall to look for more moving rings and found them shortly, seeing that they were configured in an identical way to the previous area, meaning that they should have nearly 3 days. It felt like a small amount of time to prepare when he had no clue what was to come, But it was better than nothing, as he spent a few hours examining the rest of the area, looking for any variance in the enchantments he was seeing from what he'd seen before as he went around, continuing to build up his theories on just what everything did. It was only as he'd finished that he made his way to the pile of items, finding Greed already digging through it. Find anything interesting? Just a bunch of ancient junk. Ben couldn't help but agree as he started digging through it himself. Weapons of every size, their item quality no greater than lower rare, with many enchantments almost completely broken down from lack of upkeep, the weave and other methods of arranging the magic being pointless to repair. He doubted anything he was seeing could have helped during the last part of the trial, though he couldn't know for sure if they would be useful for the next. As he stared at them, something was picking at his brain, though. The same way it was when he'd realized what was happening before was a countdown, he just couldn't put his finger on what. There's just something about these all, though. Maybe I could organize them? He didn't have any better idea, so he did just that, going through the pile to gather together knives and spears and shields and all manner of other weapons into their own groups, before moving on to what was left. Small things whose purpose was lost to time, clothing of all shapes and sizes, and other items he could only consider pointless knickknacks. He went through all of it until he got to the bottom of the pile, stopping at the last 3 items as just what was bothering him snapped into place. The 3 he was seeing seemed the oldest by far, and yet their enchantments looked pristine in comparison to what else he saw there. The rings of mana that made each up were still holding strong after what could only have been thousands of years in there, but it put the rest of the items he was seeing into perspective. The creatures that worshipped the god of this trial used their magic in the same way. The fact that he was seeing other systems of enchanting in place, no matter how decayed, could only mean that they weren't left from the god for the next section of the trial, but from the people thrown into it. A lost and found, maybe? For anyone to pick up their stuff that ends up lost in the last part? Honestly, I could see that happening a lot, but he looked again at the clothing. Some of it fresh, some undoubtedly centuries old, with what he first thought was grime far more likely to be the ancient blood of whatever race shed it. If he had to bet, he would have said it was a combination of both options. The trial storing not only whatever was lost, but the items of anyone who died. He couldn't begin to guess why, but he wouldn't look a gift horse in the mouth, especially not for the nearly pristine items that must have been made by the race of the trial's god. What looked like a cup, an armband, and a metal circle. They were all built with the same enchantment arrangement as the trial, but on a far simpler level. A mortal level, meaning he could experiment with it and learn from them, seeing how they worked in a way he simply couldn't with something as large as the trial, and after gaining every bit of knowledge he could from the limited form of analysis his 9th level enchanting gave him, he took the plunge and poured his mana into the cup to gauge its effect. It was sad to say, but it was underwhelming in a way that he felt supported his theory. The items around were nothing special, even if they were valuable clues on how he might learn about the magic structure of the long-dead race. The cup did exactly what he'd guessed from the fact that he could see the enchantments on it were water and air affinitied. It pulled moisture from the air to fill it. With that done, he grabbed what he suspected was an armband, though there was no way it would fit him, it was too small. The main enchantment on it was the non-affinitied barrier magic, and as he ran his mana through it, a barrier extended around it, providing additional defense as it did. The final one was a metal circle that looked like it would fit on his head, a fact he felt was confirmed by the fact that the main enchantment on it was dark magic. "Hey Greed, I need a hand," Ben called out as he placed it on. "What's up? I'm going to test this out. I just need you to be prepared to rip it off of me if need be." He laid down by the crab and passed his mana through it, feeling its effects as he did. Since the magic was acting on him specifically, its effects were significantly weakened, and Ben suspected it was doing even less than it should have since it wasn't built to handle a mind anything like his, but he thought he felt an effect that would compel him to focus. It was a handy application of dark magic. There were always times in life that a person might know they needed to devote their attention to something but still not manage it. He could see an item like that selling well and tucked the idea away for later. Given he had blessed focus at the 9th level, it didn't do much for him, but he'd been able to figure a few things out in his examination. Now just to test them out, he muttered as he grabbed 3 almost identical knives from the pile and stripped them of their nearly vanished enchantments before he began applying his own. He did the first in the weaving method he'd learned, which was probably the most standard way of enchanting, and decided to make it with the fire ring he had access to heat up the blade. Next he tried to make another knife show the same effect, but with the blending method he'd developed with his god based upon the principles of ritual magic. Since by its nature he had to use other magics to get it to show its full effects, it wouldn't work as a perfect comparison between the two, but it would be good enough for his purposes. Finally, he attempted to use the ring method he was seeing. He took the fire spell he wanted to work with and tried placing it down on the knife before him, starting at one end until it met the other, giving him a circle of mana, but he could immediately tell something was wrong. He could clearly see that his enchantment didn't look right compared to the ones that were already made, so he stripped it and tried again. It was only after multiple attempts that he accepted he was doing something wrong. Let's see, there must have been a particular method to make this different. If not, they would have just discovered the weave method. Of course, who am I to say they didn't? Maybe this is just that much more efficient, or maybe they preferred this one for some other reason. Either way, if I'm not stretching out my mana and connecting it to its end, how am I making it work? He tried a few different things, playing with his mana to try and get the configuration right, taking note of what was on a closer track to the proper way of doing it, along with what didn't seem right at all, and after a few hours of struggling and effort he finally got it. Success! He happily sighed. It all came down to compressing his mana and making the ring of it before it was placed, and with all 3 knives ready he tested them one by one. The weave method reacted as he expected it would, the knife quickly taking a red glow, with a lower mana cost than it would take if he had simply placed the full spell on it. Next came the blending method, where the enchantment was the same size, but the difference was in the cost and effect. He could feel more mana being drawn from him to make it work, but at the same time the blade of the knife grew white-hot in an instant, and Ben canceled the effect for fear it might melt. Finally, in the moment of truth, he checked the ring method, running his mana through it and having every mind in his head focused on the results. The mana cost ended up being in the middle of the two, more like he had just laid down the skill as a whole to get its effect than anything else, with the amount of power he got from it being slightly higher than using the weave, but not enough to choose it when one accounted for how much mana they'd need to spend. While the methods he was aware of would usually need to be maintained after 100 years or so, possibly longer depending on the skill of the enchanter who made them, the fact that there were even 3 examples for him to look at in almost perfect condition made that fact obvious. It just gave him one last thing to test as he stripped the knives down and looked them over, finding the one with the ring enchantment to be harder to remove by far. Ugh, I would have preferred to have 3 perfectly identical knives for testing this, but if it's the best I can manage then oh well. It's better than nothing. He began again to put a weave on one of the items, only this time he kept building it up, making it as complex as he could until it shattered. That wasn't a problem though, it was what he expected. He'd kept perfect track of just how he'd built them up, how complex it had gotten right before it broke. He did the same with his blending method, remaking the enchantments until the knife they were on was destroyed, taking about the same time as the first. It was as he started on the ring method that things changed. He carefully built them up, taking great care since it was a system he wasn't used to until he reached the point the other 2 broke and kept going. He was able to keep building up effects until it was almost twice as magically dense as the others until it finally gave in, the knife turning to dust in his hands. This is the most stable way of making enchantments I've ever seen, he said happily, a grin plastered across his face despite the severity of the situation. This method doesn't just break down slower, it puts so much less strain on the item it's on. Can I incorporate it with the way I currently enchant? Even if it ends up a bit weaker by trying to make it work with blending and weaving, it would be worth the trade-off. God, I need to experiment with this more. But there's so many other things to do. Crap, how am I going to make time for this all? He was so deeply in his thoughts that it was a miracle greed was able to draw him out of them. The crab's loud and shocked swearing getting just enough of his attention to make him look away from the item in his hand to the side, where a familiar gray was standing patiently. Oh, hey Quillith, wasn't expecting to see you so soon, Ben said, casually giving him a wave. Isn't there still a few days before we're supposed to meet up? Given the nature of the situation you find yourself in, I assumed it would be better to come early. It's nice to see you're somehow in good spirits despite everything. Legs, what the hell is going on? Greed asked in confusion as he looked between Ben and the alien, not understanding how he had appeared. You probably heard about the race that one of the groups of summoned individuals was helping the world, right? He's one of them. Stops by every now and then to teach me some stuff. Just what sort of freaking connections do you have? The crab asked as it shook in disbelief, an act Ben ignored to focus on the gray before him. Well, I appreciate you stopping by, but unless you have any info that could help me, I think I'm going to need to skip on lessons this month. Ben told him before his eyes lit up. Unless, of course, you could peek into the next sections of this trial and give me some spoilers? It would be really helpful for this whole not dying thing I'm trying to do. Unfortunately, things were never that easy, and the gray shook his head. We've already checked. It needs an actual person to go through it to activate. Without that, it's just an empty room no bigger than a closet.
I'm sorry.
It's fine, Ben told him as he deflated. That really would have been too lucky, wouldn't it? So what brings you here to this little nightmare? Compassion, I suppose, Quillith answered. We've spoken enough that I have some fondness for you. Since I'm the only one who can, I thought I'd collect your last words, to be passed on to whoever you'd like. Of course, since I'm here, I'll do my best for you as well, Greed. Really, in that case, great, 'cause I got a lot. The ruby crab began as Ben stood stunned. It was something he never did on his last world, something he should have done rather than spending his last night alive on the planet doing a little drawing. But Quillith was right. He was facing his end. Since he had the chance, he needed to pass on just what he wanted to say. And to Weasley, Treytru, and Jaspel, tell them all I'm sorry about the whole running away the next morning and not stopping by again. Greed finished while Ben was in his thoughts, leaving Quillith looking far more exhausted as he did. I feel like you should have solved some of these issues long ago, not waited till your death approached, Quillith said, getting a shrug in return. Hey, it's a lot easier to forgive a dead guy. If I go in person, they'll be out for blood. The alien only shook his head as he turned to Ben. Well, if you could tell Thera, Fawkes, Sonia, Steph, and Will for me that I love them and I'm sorry I won't be around to see the end of the world with them, it would mean a lot, he said with a small bow of his head. Also, I guess you can't do it since you're not really in this universe, but if you could ask one of them to pray to Myriad and tell him I say thanks for everything, I would appreciate it. I can do that. Thank you. But since I know you have eyes on me, do me one more favor and don't pass it on until I'm actually dead. No matter how hopeless it seems, I haven't given up yet. Very well. Many of us are watching with great interest, so do your best. For what it's worth, I hope you make it through this. With that, he was gone, leaving Ben alone with Greed again. He took a deep breath as he turned to the crab, thinking about what would come next as he did. All right, I don't know about you, but I'd rather live than have any goodbyes, so let's figure out what to do from here. He began as he took stock of everything they both had. Greed was far easier than him. He had his amplifier and that was it. As for Ben, he had 16 rings on his fingers, the 10 level 9 affinitied rings, a level 6 charm ring, level 8 barrier ring, and then the 4 rings he'd gotten from Pelenia to improve Thera's brace. He had worn them over dinner, fully intending to put them to use that night, but now they were just another resource to take advantage of as he moved on from there. Aside from that, he didn't have much. He had the clothes on his back, a couple blank skill rings as well as his cursed ring in his pocket, along with his job crystal, a small disc of white mana crystal with a little bit of mithril set in it, and most important of all, he had his coat, the First Church of Myriad. It had already helped save his life on the last section of the trial, so he immediately got to work stripping the defensive enchantments already on it in favor of adding all of the higher-level skills he now had access to while he spoke to Greed. Alright, so one of my skills lets me enchant with the skills other people have. I won't be able to use anything over the 8th level, so your awakened skills are out for me sadly. But other than that, can you tell me what you have? Sure, he said, immediately becoming shifty at the question. They're all very normal though. Not sure how much help they'll be. He listed everything he had and Ben had to admit they did sound exceptionally normal. He was sure there was nothing he could use at all until Greed got to the last one. And finally, I've got Shell Enhancement at the 5th level. Shell Enhancement? Ben asked as he perked up. What's that? A defensive skill. Yeah, it's a passive one to strengthen it. As tough as the one I already have is, since I walk around you giants plenty, I've been stepped on more than once. It's handy for me at least, but I'm not sure how well it works for you. No offense, but you're kind of fleshy. None taken. It wouldn't be used on me. It would be blended into my barrier enchantment to enhance its effects. This is a great find. I don't suppose it has any magical resistance tied to it as well. Does it? Nope, just physical. Darn. As nice as it would have been to have stumbled across something that he could have used to help Thera, it was still something that could help him immediately, so he put on his blank rings and touched Greed, connecting with him to try and get the skill onto one of them, only to receive a huge shock as the new effect that came with his 9th level of enchanting activated, letting him see the skills and levels he had as he did. He couldn't stop a smile from breaking out across his face as it happened. The interaction between connect and enchanting just kept bearing fruit for him. Before, he'd have to feel each skill and grab onto it before he copied it, making sure he didn't accidentally go back to grab the same one or miss one. It helped if a person actually used their skill as he was doing it, letting him pick it out as he went, but now they were all clear before him with their names and levels displayed. It wasn't like he'd gained access to Greed's full status. He could see no other information. The affinities, resistances, titles, and even his name were all hidden away from him, but at the same time this was more than a lot of people would ever actually want seen. That didn't keep Ben from commenting on the one skill Greed hadn't listed after he'd gotten shell enhancement on a ring though. You left out your Zeroth level of sacrilege, he said offhandedly as the crab looked to the side guiltily. Well, what was the point of asking for my skills if you could just tell what they were? He said awkwardly before breaking into a mutter. Honestly, you seduce one priestess in a church and suddenly the gods get all grumpy. I'm not judging, Ben said with a shrug. You're talking to a 6th level sacrilege holder. I just think we need to be honest with each other since our lives are on the line. 6th level? He asked, filled with shock. I've never heard of anyone with it that high. Aren't you an apostle? Not a very good one, Ben told him before finishing up altering his jacket, blending the effects he needed from shell enhancement into the barrier magic on it. Anyway, next we need to worry about your food issue. It's been 4 days. How are you feeling? Hungry, Greed admitted. Even if I can live for weeks, it's not going to be fun and I'm going to be basically useless by the end of it. Depending on how long this is, you might need to toss me into your pocket for at least a few sections of this. We can only hope it won't be too long. I have a bit of a worry about that, Ben said hesitantly. From the outside and the way the trial is built, it looks like it's 11 floors high. That might mean 11 different challenges, or at least that's the guess I'm working off of. I guess we could always get lucky and the last floor is where we accept the reward, or we could be ridiculously lucky and each of these rest zones is a floor too, meaning there'd only be 5 sections, but honestly I don't really want to count on luck. If we keep getting breaks between trials and the time we have doesn't shrink, we might be here for a while if we don't die. So you're saying we need to rush through it or I'll starve? Or we find a different option for you? Ha! Legs, I appreciate the thought, but there isn't exactly a ton of food up here. If I can't eat the bit that's provided, then I'm shit out of luck. I guess I could try to keep healing myself to force it down, but with the way that one bite made me feel, I don't know if that's really viable. There's one more option, Ben told him as he stood up and walked to the pile of items, picking up the sharpest knife he could find and applying an enchantment to it as he walked back, seeing Greed begin to panic as he did. Hey Legs, let's not do anything crazy here. I'm light. Worst to worst, just toss me in your pocket. It will be fine. Alright, no clue where your head's at, but desperate times call for desperate measures, man. Just relax. I'm going to like this a lot less than you are, he told the crab before dragging the knife across his palm. What the hell are you doing? Greed yelled as Ben's cupped palm was lowered to him as it slowly filled with blood. Hopefully getting you food. Now come on and drink up. Worst to worst, I can cut off some skin if you need it, but let's see if a liquid diet can sate you for now. Legs, you're being crazy. I can't just drink your blood. Greed. For our best chance, you need your strength. I'm going to be relying on your buffs and healing almost constantly while we're stuck in here, so I need you to be in good shape for casting magic. I'm not just asking you to do this for you. I'm asking you to do it for me. Positioning it as something for his own sake as well helped break down greed's resistance as he leaned in and started drinking. Ben's first instinct was to ask how it tasted, wanting some confirmation on his belief that he might just be unusually tasty, but held back in consideration for the other man. He wasn't lying after all, he needed greed, so he didn't want to do anything that would put him off of eating. It was only as he had his fill that he stopped, giving an impression of being deeply conflicted as he did and healed the cut on Ben's hand before buffing both his mana and mana regen at his request. With that done, Ben walked up to the pile of items again, this time taking what seemed to be a broken fragment of something, a piece of metal about as large as his palm, and sat down to stare at it. He was determined to survive, and that meant using everything at his disposal, so with that goal in mind he decided he would figure out how to use his newest skill, Material User. He was all but certain it had to be a non-affinitied magic skill. The fact that he hadn't heard of it before meant it was on the rarer end of the spectrum. But that didn't matter. He had read hundreds of books on magic at this point. Even without a guide, he could figure it out. From the name alone, it sounded like a magic that could be used on anything like telekinesis would. The main question was how. He ran his mana into the piece of metal in his hand, and with an effort of will, made it rise up about a foot above where he was holding it, bringing a smile to his face until he almost immediately felt the effects of mana exhaustion, only stopping in time to keep himself from passing out. Well, that's not good. Just how costly doing something as small as that was proof enough that whatever the magic did, it probably wasn't meant to be used for combat. While it was common knowledge that non-affinity magics had significantly steeper mana costs to do the same thing as an equivalent affinity magic, with that difference only growing depending on how good of an affinity a mage had, that still felt unusually steep. He was being buffed to the extreme and had almost run out of mana in seconds. If he'd attempted it without the buff, who could know how long he would be out for? Well, it's a Zeroth level skill, but still, if I compare it to a Zeroth level telekinesis, then I still think it's 5 or 10 times worse mana-wise. I need a different way of thinking about it. It's called Material User, and I got it as the bonus skill for awakening my crafting, so it has to be deeply related. When I'm making something, how do I use my materials? What would I want to be able to do with anything I'm working on where mana could help? When he asked himself that, the answer became obvious. There was only one way he would really want to be able to use his mana for his crafting. In fact, he already did, just to a significantly lesser degree compared to what he thought he was going to get as he once again filled the piece of metal with his mana, only this time, instead of trying to move it or raise it in the air, he tried to change it on a deeper level. He looked at it in his hands as he focused before closing his fist around it and squeezing, the now far softer material gushing out the sides of his fingers like dough as his eyes lit up. He stopped running his mana through it, and it held its new shape while returning to its original solid properties. Okay, this is incredible and I'm so happy. System or world or whatever I'm supposed to call you. I love you. Having a magic he could use was incredible enough, but it also aligned perfectly with what he would want to do with it. It could enhance the things he already enjoyed, namely his crafting, and he was all but certain he'd be having an easy time getting used to it. I have 9 jobs giving it bonuses to one degree or another, 3 blessings from gods, and greed around to buff my mana. Tie that to everything I know about magic and I'm going to fly through the first couple levels at least. He continued to experiment from there as the hours rolled by, testing what he thought would work and learning what wouldn't with each attempt, getting more and more acquainted with his skill as he did. Despite how annoying its mana cost was, he just needed to take a few breaks on occasion if he used too much, taking the time to reflect on what he'd figured out as well as look closer at the trial, trying to glean whatever he could with his growing knowledge pool on the nature of the way it was made. His mind was a mass of theories, even when he was trying to learn the ins and outs of his newest skill, and as time went on he felt himself grow and progress. He thought he was on the edge of something with the trial, but he couldn't quite make the final leap to whatever his brain was picking at. His magic, though, was a different story. As the hours wore on, he'd learned many things. On top of changing the consistency and material properties of something, he'd learned that he could affect the degree to which they changed, altering them in ways that suited him best. He didn't need to change the entire thing either, being able to focus on only one area to selectively change its properties, while the rest of the material was left unaltered. More important than that, though, was the discovery that he could alter it to a greater extent than he'd originally thought. After rolling the metal he was testing into a ball in his hands, he worked and manipulated the mana he was using to pull it out, stretching it and molding it to give it features until it was a clumsy approximation of a face. It wasn't as good as if he'd done the details by hand, but it was still plenty exciting, and with little else to do he trained the skill as hard as he could as the time limit ticked down. Perfect! Ben sighed contentedly as the notification went off in his head. He had about an hour before they needed to enter the trial, plenty of time to regain the mana he'd spent, and with the level up he was feeling good. He'd only slept for a couple hours with everything going on, but he was still feeling refreshed as he waited. Over 2 days had been spent devoting himself to studying the trial and working on his magic, and the fact that the second option had managed to have a bit of payoff at the end was already more than he'd hoped. I guess it just goes to show that jobs really aren't for nothing. I should try to make sure I complete the more important ones as optimally as I can in the future. He knew without a doubt that he'd have never leveled up his magic in the span of only a couple of days if it weren't for the effects of all of his jobs acting on it, as well as the blessings he had. He could see the effect when it came to his mind skills well enough. He never had much issue leveling up the simpler ones if he really worked for it, but he'd never gotten to see that effect on any of his crafting skills. Both crafting and enchanting had mostly been growing with his jobs, and with the only other one being enchanting knowledge, which was more dependent on how much he could read than any actual training, he'd never gotten to see just how fast he could rise up through the levels until now. As long as there were items in the next section for him too, he just might be able to put himself into a better position for whatever came after it thanks to the level he'd gained, but he'd have to survive the coming section first as he looked down at greed in his hand. I don't know what's coming, but it's probably going to suck. You ready? Need a bite beforehand? Ugh. Don't make me think about what's filling my stomach when we might die, he complained. Besides, I need to hang on to all of the mana I can. Buffing my own recovery rate is one thing, but I can't buff my mana pool and you take an unreasonable amount to heal. Not to mention all the buffs I've already got on you. How are you feeling? Powerful. Every attribute Ben had was currently being buffed. He normally would never consider taking them if he could help it. While an attribute was buffed, a person's growth rates essentially turned to 0, and as handy as they could be at the time, he'd much rather choose to grow however much he could from the situations he was in, but this was different. Both of their lives were on the line. He needed to do everything he could to get through whatever was about to be thrown at him as he went through the door. He took a long deep breath to try and calm his nerves as he pushed his focus and other mind skills to their limits. He didn't know what to expect, so he had to be ready for everything as he took his first steps to the door, pushed it open, and found himself stepping into an empty void 1 minute and the next being what he could only call a desert. He was more than grateful to still be standing on solid ground as he took in the surroundings, turning his head to get the full view as he did. The door he'd stopped through had vanished, leaving him in an endless plain of sand and mountains, all completely barren, with the two of them being the only signs of life around. A small part of him couldn't help but think how helpful it would have been to have Thera there, but he quickly pushed it to the side. As much as he wanted to see her, as much as he wanted her help, it was better she wasn't stuck in a situation like that with him. With nothing to go off of as to what the purpose of the trial was other than what he'd seen in the last, he began looking for a light as he moved, deciding to go forward as he desperately hoped that the god who'd made it wasn't so cruel as to point him in the wrong direction as it started. At the very least, it looks like one of my theories might be right. I'll have to see the next one to be sure, but if it is, well, one problem at a time. Before he'd entered, he had been careful to compare the magic he'd seen from the first room they'd been in to the second, and though he couldn't be sure, there were a couple differences that were apparent. The most meaningful of which was that in the first room he'd seen more air enchantments, and in the second he'd seen more earth. If each section was going to have a different magic theme, he wasn't thrilled with the implications for just how long they'd be stuck there, nor how well it would fit with the idea that the tower had 11 floors, so those thoughts too he pushed away. At least for the first few minutes, neither of them had any complaints. It was actually surprisingly pleasant as Ben rushed through the sand, moving faster thanks to the buff than he ever had before. Despite being a desert, the temperature was moderate, and there was neither wind nor humidity to make things worse for them. The sky above still lacked a sun, but the level of light wasn't blinding for them either. He was sure he'd be able to see the distant glow of the exit so long as he was alert, The main task was just being in a range where that would be possible. I hate to say this so freaking much, but do you think we should try and climb a mountain to get a better view of where it might be? He asked Greed, trying to get some ideas of just what they could even do. How many hours do you think that would take? A lot. Gods above, I don't know. I'll leave the choice to you. The crab sighed, having no better idea either. It was only as Ben decided to commit to it that everything went to hell. It started as a simple dot in the sky that Ben knew better than to believe was harmless, and he stared at it as he ran, trying to keep vigilant of anything else as it got bigger and bigger in a matter of seconds, leaving them both to swear up a storm as they understood just what they were seeing. Of all things, an asteroid. He could only wonder if he was about to instantly die, if there was no way of beating the second trial because it was pulling insane nonsense like that. If it hit him, he was done for, plain and simple. As it grew, he guessed it had to be almost 50 meters across, which he was sure would be large enough to destroy a city on Earth if it wasn't stopped. So even if it hit nearby, he'd be in a horrific level of trouble. It was only as he saw it sail overhead that he breathed a small sigh of relief that was cut far too short as he felt the impact and his body went flying after that, with clouds of dirt raining down on him and blocking his vision as he did, the dust filling his eyes as he struggled to get up. Greed was still tight in his grasp, as miserable from the experience as he was, but at the very least they were alive as Ben got to his feet and ran like his life depended on it, choosing to go up the mountain for certain now that he wouldn't be able to see from the ground. On the plus side, since I'm not dead, it looks like that probably didn't have the same force it would have had if it came from space. On the negative, things only got worse as time went on in the last part, so he let the thought hang as he heard another impact farther away and felt the ground shake. It seemed like the trial wasn't specifically targeting them at least, but that was a small comfort. It was making up for it with the scale of its attacks. It was only as he felt the ground shake a third time and another cloud of dirt was kicked into the air that he made it to the mountain and began climbing up it. It was an activity he hadn't done much on this word or his last, and he attributed any speed and success he had with it to his buffs. He was faster than he had any right to be, even with the ground all but exploding around him from time to time and knocking him off his feet, with the time between crashes growing shorter as each impact was more powerful, but soon enough he was at the top, gazing across the expanse around him. There was so much dirt in the air, even all the way up there, that his eyes watered and stung, but as he looked around he could only gasp. More had been happening than just the falling asteroids causing chaos around him. He could see areas where the Earth had split open into deep canyons he was sure he'd never escape if he fell into, along with something far more worrying. Hey Greed. Yeah. Weren't there a few more mountains around before? Think so. Oh boy, this isn't good. He didn't know if they'd been taken out by meteors or some other event, but he instantly didn't want to be so high up as he frantically looked about for anything that could be a light amidst all of the chaos around him and thought he might see a faint glimmer of in the distance, with only the minor problem that he'd have to go around one of the new canyons to get to it. He could only hope he was right and it wasn't the trial playing some cruel joke, growing a crystal to reflect the light or something as he began running down. It was at halfway into his descent that he heard a noise coming from behind him, a rolling, tumbling sound that he lifted Greed to check for him, being rewarded with an intense scream in his ear as he did. The entire freaking mountain is collapsing. What? He couldn't believe it, at least not until the first boulder rolled by him. How was it happening? Mountains didn't just crumble for no reason. He had to remind himself that he wasn't really on a mountain, he was in a trial. He was playing by the rules of a dead god. All he could do was try to push through. He kept holding up Greed to watch behind them, letting him shout if he needed to move away as anything came down while he ran for his life. All of his minds were devoted to the task. He knew if he tripped it could spell his end, just like every other part of the trial if he wasn't careful. Not thinking crap like that, just focusing on my feet. Every step counts. He was moving so fast that he was equal parts running and falling down the mountainside, but when he finally made it to the bottom he couldn't relax and he used his momentum to keep going. As abysmal as his agility typically felt, his stamina let him push himself harder than he ever had before without stopping as he rushed to the area. He thought the next gate was waiting. Not stopping even after a few hours of running left him in pain and exhausted, no matter how much of Greed's magic was applied to him. He finally had the canyon in view and took a subtle turn to the right, trying to direct himself to the shortest side of it to get him to his destination without dropping any speed as he went, only for another problem to rear its ugly head. The canyon had grown since he'd first seen it. Ben wanted to scream. Of course things had only gotten worse. He could still feel the crashing and tearing of the earth happening all around him. All he could do was keep going and hope as he was taken way off course to go around it. There's no way this is the creator-approved way of beating this stupid thing. The god that made this must have expected us to be high-level air mages or something to fly through it. Still he pushed himself, putting everything he could into his sprint as he went until he was at the edge and got as close as he dared to run around, only for another disaster to strike them. Another asteroid, the biggest yet, dropped all too close and threw them into the air, directly towards the growing gash in the land. With nothing else he could do, Ben tossed Greed to safety as he was thrown over the edge, barely able to hang on for dear life before he was trapped yet again. Not by any trap of the trial, but by the limits of his body. As he hung from the edge by his fingertips, nothing but death below him, he couldn't muster the strength to pull himself up. Even with the buffs, even with the healing, he'd pushed himself too hard for too long. He had nothing left to give. It was only as he felt something touch his finger and heard Greed screaming for him that it felt like an untouched source of power had been released, that he could fight through the pain and exhaustion, and with all of his will dragged himself up the rock's edge, his fingers raw and bloody from the effort of just holding on until them, and as fast as he could he got back to his feet, picking up the crab and continuing on his way. "Not sure what you did to me, but it worked," he said gratefully between breaths. "I wouldn't thank me too much. That was a last-ditch effort spell. Even if I work to heal you, you won't be moving right for days. We're going to be in trouble for the next one." "Of course we are," he thought, resigned to his fate. "In that case, I better make it count." He fought back the feeling that he was going to be sick as he sprinted on, and ignored the subtle wetness he felt coming from the orifices on his face. His nose was telling him it was blood, but he couldn't be too bothered by however he was destroying his body at the moment as the gate finally came into view. He didn't let himself feel any relief. He wouldn't until he was on the other side of it. There was still enough distance for something to happen, and it was that vigilance that saved his life. All of his minds had never stopped. They were a flurry of activity watching out for anything they could, and thanks to that his body had reacted before he was even consciously aware that anything was wrong. With a complete lack of grace, he threw himself forward, narrowly missing an attack that he'd seen Thera use on more than one occasion as an earthen saw spring from the ground, trying to dig into him as it did. He tried not to lose any speed, but as soon as he regained his footing he was almost hit by another, and another after that until he was finally right in front of the gate. His instincts were screaming at him that something was about to explode from the ground in front of it, and lacking any sort of grace he threw himself through, feeling the sharp bite of a jagged blade digging into his calf as he did, just one more bit of pain to go along with the rest of him. But he had done it, he was on the other side. His greatest desire was to just lay there on the ground where he fell, face down on his stomach and let the agony take him. But he had things to do. The first of which being the small act of wiggling his toes, confirming he hadn't lost a leg at the end there, and the second being rolling over to get a look at the wall, confirming that the countdown on the room they were in was the same as the last two. It was only once both of those were done that he released his tight grip on Greed, letting the crab speak up now that they were safe. "Legs? Yeah. I'm so glad the god that made this is dead. No arguments here." All he wanted to do was give in to his body's demand that he pass out. But he knew that he couldn't. They were in a state of emergency. Even though Greed would be able to repair the damage he'd put his body through working it like that, it would take days that they didn't have. If he couldn't move, he needed to at least be able to think. It was with that goal in mind that he looked at the enchantments that were within his field of view and focused on them, making himself fall into everything that made them what they were. They both needed more time than what they had, and he was determined to get it, if alone to spite the god that went to all of the effort to make the trial. As he did, Greed spoke to him and he let one of his minds listen half-heartedly, though he didn't speak back. He didn't think he could. Rolling over and his brief exchange with his soul companion had used up his last bit of whatever energy Greed had managed to provide him, and all that was left was pain. He wasn't positive what had been done, But he was fairly sure that instead of a buff, Greed had forcefully used magic to make his body work beyond its limits, destroying itself in the process. It was one of the more destructive potential aspects of the life affinity, one most people couldn't manage unless they'd awoken their skill, and even then wouldn't use unless things were beyond desperate. Not that Ben disagreed with his choice. If Greed hadn't done that, they'd both be dead. Ideas kept spinning around his brain and he wanted to test them, but it would need to wait. He would need Greed's help, as well as enough strength in his arms to move them, which meant none of what he wanted to do could be put into practice until later into his healing. For the time being, he could only refine his thoughts to a razor's edge, ready to cut away the problem that was the trial. Greed, I need a knife. Those were the first words he spoke as soon as he could after almost 12 hours of healing. He could have asked by connecting to the crab, but his arms were still too damaged to move at the time. There had been no point. Now at least one was functional enough to grab onto something if he had to, and he didn't want to waste another moment. Is it important? Honestly, legs, if we have to go through the next section in what? 2 days or less. I'd rather get you into the best shape you can be for it. It is. I'd go so far as to say if I succeed we'll probably live, and if I fail we'll die. I think we both know that I won't be in tip-top shape by the time the countdown's done, and you must need to stop to replenish mana soon, right? Well, I'm still buffing myself, but yeah, it's getting tight. Alright, give me a minute 'cause lucky you. There's 2 piles of old crap this time. Yay! He managed to get out sarcastically as the other left to get what he was looking for, dragging it to his hand as he did before restarting on treating all of Ben's wounds, ensuring he wouldn't die before the next part of the trial came. With knife in hand, he grasped it tightly, placing the arm that held it across his chest so he could get a better look, only to need to make one more request of Greed. Looks like I may need some cloth to prop my head up a bit too, please. It wasn't for comfort, though he would definitely appreciate whatever little bit he could get. He needed to prop his head up to be able to get a better look as he worked on the knife, wanting to see every enchantment he'd be making in detail as he did. This time Greed did exactly as he was asked without arguments. He knew as well as Ben that things were already looking bad. If there was a chance, then he'd take it. It was only as Ben was set up that he looked at the fragments of ancient enchantments and cleared them all away that he got to work. Using the ring system that he'd experimented with before the last section, he placed a series of them on the knife before breaking them down. It was harder than usual, another sign of the stability of the system, but nothing as impossible as breaking down the enchantments on the trial itself had proven to be, and he remade them again, different this time and repeating the process. He let the hours roll by as Greed healed him, spending the time making and breaking enchantments, drawing more and more accustomed to the new system as he did, slowly learning the ins and outs, along with what worked and what wouldn't. If he wasn't in so much pain, if he wasn't so angry both at the people who had thrown him in there as well as the God who'd made it, he would have found the work interesting and rewarding. As things stood, rage was his main motivator, even more so than a desire to live. He wouldn't die just to spite whoever wanted him to. He would get out and see the people he cared about again, and he would destroy this trial. It took another 12 hours of healing by the time he was good enough to stand, but by then he was feeling confident in himself. He wasn't constantly studying enchanting for nothing, and if what he had seen at the crafting contest was any indication, then he had one of the broadest understandings of the skill on the planet. There was always more to learn, but what he did he knew well. He forced himself to his feet despite Greed's protests and placed his hands against the wall, using it to support his weight as he did to keep himself from falling. Greed, I need you to buff my mana and my regen again. Legs, we still have plenty of time. Let me treat you a bit longer before you try anything. Every second counts, man, come on. The sooner we do this, the better. The crab could only sigh at his stubbornness but did as he was asked, making Ben's still sore body flood with mana in the process as he began talking, as much to the trial itself as he was to Greed. You know, I don't actually know what happens when a god dies. Do they get a ghost? Do they ascend to whatever afterlife is waiting for the rest of us mortals? I hope so. I hope whoever it is that made this is still around in some capacity to watch in horror at what I'm about to do. He activated all of his skill rings and connected to each of them while at the same time pushing his mind skills beyond the ordinary limits he would be trapped by, as he envisioned an enchantment unlike any other. He knew he couldn't break what was on this trial, but at the very least he could see about adding to it. Unlike how he usually made his enchantments, he didn't build it up with time. Instead, he took all of the mana within himself that he could without passing out and shaped it all at once. Every mind in his head devoted to the task of working them into the form of those on the trial, only with a few touches to enhance them. He couldn't compete with what the god who'd made them had done if he played completely by those rules, but in his hours of practice he'd figured out as much as he needed to while learning how it could be incorporated into his existing methods. And once he was certain everything was as perfect as it could be, he placed them all down at once, interlocking them with the rings controlling the floor's countdown and locking them into place, keeping them from moving again, only for his eyes to fill with light and notifications to fill his minds. Thera put down the book she was reading, surprised to have gotten the level up. Even if she was doing her best to learn it, she felt that she was too distracted by the last week for anything to have really gotten through. Ben still hadn't gotten out of the trial. She could still feel his direction thanks to the skill they shared, but that was a small comfort that did nothing for her misery. She was so horribly lonely, in a way she'd never been before they'd met. Her life had been filled with nothing but solitude and awkward encounters for as long as she could remember. She should have been used to it, but then he'd come in and stripped that all away. She'd gotten to see just how nice having friends could be, to care about someone and to be cared about in return, and now he was gone. He's not gone, she chided herself. He's just stuck for now. He'll be back and things will be fine. I just need to be patient. As much as she hated it, it had only been a week. While there were plenty of shorter trials, there were longer ones too. She just needed to wait it out. No matter how bad it felt, she just needed to be patient. Looking down from her seat in the woods, she cast a few more healing spells before firing off some dark ones too towards the swarm of fighting beasts below her. She was trying to be a bit more creative with it than she'd been in the first few days, using her life magic to enhance the strength of the weaker creatures around her, while her dark magic was put towards weakening the stronger. It took a lot of concentration and effort to do both, the power behind her magics wanting to explode around her instead of hitting specific targets, but she held it in, pushing her control to the limits to get the results she wanted. She no longer let herself worry about how raising her dark magic could affect her charm. She just wanted to be better. She didn't want to feel so powerless, even though increasing her levels wouldn't change things for her at all. Raw strength or skill couldn't change the fact that she was alone. It was as she was doing this that a swarm of earth spirits came to her, buzzing about her head as they did as she tried to hide some of her feelings to keep herself from taking them out on them. "Greetings, Earthkin. Are you well?" one asked hesitantly as it saw the carnage below them. Thera had been using the same spot for her training for days, and the ground was soaked with blood as a result, with its surface covered in bones. "I'm fine. Did my father ask you all to check on me?" "No, should the Great One have?" it asked in confusion, only to immediately be brushed off. "No, it's fine. In that case, what can I do for you all? We'd heard that you could help us after more spirits have been produced. We've come seeking aid." "The usual then. Okay. Come on, one by one." She held out her hand, leaving each spirit to fly to it as she did, filling them each with mana to make up for what they'd lost. Earth spirits were nice because of just how easy they were to give mana to. There was no mana loss, and the process was fast enough that it didn't take long at all, leaving them to thank her as they went on their way. She ignored the notification in her head and decided it was time to clean up for the day. She'd been there for so many hours that even though it was still bright, night would be falling in all faith, and she wanted to get back to rest while she could, even if she doubted she'd be sleeping well. To finish things up below her, she used her dark magic to debuff every beast she could see, the quantity of her mana keeping them all but defenseless, as she used her telekinesis to pull some fallen logs from the surroundings and crush each creature one by one. If it wasn't for the constant worry she'd been feeling, she would have been elated. To have so many skills level up at once had made it an exceptionally lucky day, with the growth of her 2 magic skills being excellent news for her control as a whole. She knew that she didn't typically train those 2 magics enough. Dark magic was almost entirely untouched with the exception of a little bit of practice should she ever find herself needing it in an emergency, and telekinesis was mostly just used to enhance her earth magic. Since she had a staff that could stand up to her magic and nothing but time to practice both with, it would do her no harm to try and get more levels of each as she distracted herself from everything like she wanted to. A goal that got harder from the guests standing outside the embassy waiting for her. Steph and Will were both standing around, and she could tell from their eyes that both had been crying. They looked terrible and exhausted, like they'd been getting as much rest as she had, but they still came to see her. "Hi," Steph said, putting on a small smile. We thought we'd come see how you're holding up." "I'm fine," she told them. Feeling glad to have her cloak on to hide, however, she was looking from the world. "I was just going to get some rest." "Oh, okay. But if you need anything, you can stop by or call for us, you know. We want to help." "Thank you. I might visit in a couple weeks. I just need some time to myself." They gave a nod and walked away as Thera went in and threw herself in bed. It was nice enough of them to come by, and she was lonely, but there was really only one person she wanted to see. Falk walked down the darkened, empty street of All Faith, a strong drink and 2 glasses in hand as he got to where he wanted to be, the trial of the dead god, and took a seat beside the Great Spirit leaning against its sealed door. "Don't suppose you'd share a drink with an old friend?" the Yeti said as he handed a cup over and filled it as Abris chuckled. "Does a few decades make us old friends? It does for any other race on this world. Good friends, then?" "Yes, I'd love to share one with a good friend," the spirit said as he patted Falk's shoulder as they both had a sip. For a while they just drank in silence, doing their best to enjoy each other's company, and the night before Falk leaned his head back against the wall, covering his moistening eyes with his hands. "Infinite hells," he muttered. "You know, I never even wanted a damnable apprentice." "Ha, I know. I remember you always going off about what a waste of time it was to train someone up when you still had so much to learn. I also remember you scaring off more than a few hopeful students with your ridiculous challenges if they wanted to be under you. Just my luck that someone without the sense finally came along and pulled it off. Worse luck that I discovered training someone wasn't actually so bad." Falk. The boy was incredible. Abris. He had a passion and drive I've rarely seen. A love for making things that anyone who views smithing or other works as just a job could never hope for. I think it was only a year into training him that I realized he was actually going to awaken a skill one day. He had so much bloody potential. I know there were only greater things to come for him, and that selfish ripped it all away. "Is there an execution date yet?" "Couple days away," Falk told him as he took a deep swig. "A scandal this big, they want it done fast. The fact that someone with so much power in All Faith of all places was acting like this, there's talk the gods might actually toss his soul into the infinite hells for the act. I can only hope they actually do." "He's not dead yet, you know," Abris pointed out, wanting to give his friend a bit of hope. "His god would know if his apostle died, and Pelania asked to be informed. He's still hanging on." Despite the intention behind it though, Falk easily brushed it away. "I'm not one to hang onto something so slim. Anyway, enough about me. I'm more worried for your daughter. Do you know how Thera's holding up? I've barely seen her in days. I have a couple air spirits watching her from a distance. She's behaving destructively, but at least not self-destructively, which is really the most her mother and I could hope for. I knew she'd have to get used to experiencing loss eventually, but I always thought it would be a few more decades away," the Great Spirit sighed. "I doubt she'll leave the city until things end one way or another. We've already arranged things to ensure she'll have her room at the embassy for as long as she needs. But what about you?" "I'm heading back after the execution. Sonia cared for the boy too. I'd rather she hear what happened in person than through a letter. I'll try to talk to Thera a bit before I go." "You're a good man, Falk." They quietly finished their drinks and Falk walked away once he was done, turning back to cast one last look at the trial and felt something about it scratch at his mind, but he just shook his head and walked away. In the heavens, the goddess Analia was dealing with her own stress. All of the gods had been in an uproar over just what had happened in All Faith. The fact that someone who had so much power in a city where many of them kept their trials and their churches was a scandal, even more so for the fact that it had escaped their notice for so long. In a time when we need to be at our best, this just had to happen. They couldn't escape any blame for it. An investigation on the matter had shown almost a dozen people had been killed that way, with likely plenty more in the past from anyone else who'd had the same idea. They were just also caught up with other matters, guiding and strengthening their people, discussions on strategy for when the invasion finally began, what to do in the event that this world fell to. All important but narrowed their focus. And then there's the matter of one god in particular. She left her realm to make her way to the edge of another, where a different goddess was already waiting and watching Myriad stare down at the world. How is he? He hasn't moved from there since Alep was secured, Hellori told her, worry covering the goddess's face in a way she'd never show her believers. He's taking this harder than I would have thought. Can any of us blame him, though? Analia sighed. It was the first believer he'd had in how many centuries? Not only that, but one who'd done incredible things for getting him faith. Honestly, I feel this loss more than I expected myself. I'd say any god whose worshippers have a passive magic do. Whether he appreciated the fact or not, that child had helped change the world with his creation during his brief time on it. The effects that were felt would last forever, not just for the people but for his god. As long as races had passive effects that needed to be suppressed, Myriad would have to have believers. Even if disaster struck the cube and lost him all he had, the other gods would have no choice but to ensure he gained at least a few. To make a mark on the world in whatever short time they had was typically all a mortal could hope for in their life, and Ben had managed it. All Analia could do was her best for those left behind. With that, she entered Myriad's realm and approached him, trying to figure out just what to say. He was a god that was making himself closer to his believers than most did, taking the time to interact with them all at a frequency that the mortals experiencing it could only find shocking, but in the past week he'd all but fallen silent. It was concerning not only to the gods around him but his followers as well. Losing a pillar of their faith always hurt. Apostles, head priests, oracles, these were the ones a god would interact with the most, being in charge of the day-to-day operation of managing the faith, but it was something any god had to be used to. It was only Myriad who'd been alone for so long that he'd forgotten just what the experience was like. It was only as she was almost behind him that he suddenly burst into laughter, talking to himself and leaving her more than worried for the state of his mind. She knew he was an unusual god in many ways, but the last thing anyone needed was him falling into madness. Ben, you absolute psycho. You maniac. What other mortal would even think about trying something like that, let alone succeed? Does this mean you awakened the skill only days after leveling it up? You really are ridiculous. Myriad, that's enough. She tried to tell him gently. We can't have you trying to escape the reality of this. I know he may not be dead yet, but it's a matter of time. You still lack a head priest. You should at least try and find someone to take the role while keeping an eye out for someone to take Ben's place. It felt harsh to say, but the cube turned to her, seeming to be surprised by her presence yet in good cheer despite everything. Oh, Analia. Sorry I didn't notice you arrive. I guess I have been a little distracted these last few days. But don't worry too much. I have a person in mind for my priestess and I'm feeling confident I won't need to find a new apostle anytime soon. She held back a sigh as she tried to look at him kindly, not wanting to be too harsh but needing him to accept the reality of the situation. Myriad, your apostle was competent. I would never deny that, but that's not enough. We may not know what goes on in that trial, but the fact that nobody who's ever tested themselves against it has come out is telling enough. Mortals who've spent years planning for everything before entering to see if they'd beat it still fail to come out in the end. Someone thrown in there doesn't have a chance. Well, why don't you give this a look first, and I'll hang on to my little bit of hope for now. She indulged him, leaning her head over the top of him to look down at the trial from the heavens, only to feel herself gasp. That's impossible, she muttered while knowing her eyes weren't betraying her. He'd have had to have deciphered an entirely unique enchanting system and had the strength to interfere with the magic on the trial. That's too much to expect of any mortal in such a short span of time. Yet she couldn't deny what she was seeing. A section of the trial, so small it would be unnoticeable to anyone not looking for it, had a single new enchantment on it. It was far clunkier than anything a god would do, but by the standards of a mortal it was exceptional. More important than that though was the fact that while it largely used the same enchanting system as the rest of the trial, it was clearly modified to incorporate two others. "That's my apostle," the cube said proudly. "As annoying, unlucky, and completely undevoted as he is, he's also stubborn and clever and not one to give up. Just you wait, he's going to survive this. The trial should have a self-correction mechanism on," she pointed out, not wanting to take his hope but wanting him to be prepared for the worst. "One change doesn't mean much." "No, but as long as he keeps doing it, that's all that matters. As far as I'm concerned, this is proof he hasn't given up. The others should keep their eyes out as well. If anyone is feeling in a gambling mood, I'll bet all the faith I have he survives this." "Holy shit, did you just awaken a skill?" Greed called out as he saw Ben's body flash with light as it flooded with mana. "Yeah, and it's a sick joke," he told the crab, feeling all the more annoyed for it. He'd have to test the difference for his enchanting skill. He was sure it would have improved leaps and bounds above what he'd just done, but that was meaningless in the face of what he was seeing. With the incredible increase to everything that came with improving his skill, he also had an increase to his mana sense unlike with any other level up. Honestly, saying I have divine enchanting is just bullying at this point. There's no way I can enchant like that. He tested it out too, trying to make a simple enchantment on his clothing that would do nothing, just to see the overall quality change of his skill, and if it weren't for the improvements to his mana sense, he would have been more than satisfied. His enchanting still wasn't as good as what he'd originally seen from the trial, but he actually wasn't far off. A couple of levels and he was sure he'd reach what the god who'd made the trial had done. That was until his sense had improved and showed the enchantment to a whole other level. Along each ring, there seemed to be some non-affinitied mana binding each one. He could only assume it was strengthening it, but he didn't know if it had any other effects. All he really knew was that he doubted he'd be able to do anything like it without being on the edge of the third tier, maybe even needing it to be a third-tier skill. He could only shake his head in frustration, all the more so for the way his enchanting had awakened. The skill had absorbed enchanting knowledge, but it didn't take connect like he thought it would. He'd have to test it out to be sure, but he was certain that meant he wouldn't be able to enchant with awakened skills like he'd hoped, though he at least had Greed around to test that concern out. Greed, though, had a different immediate thought. "Wait, are you seriously saying your skill is called Divine Enchanting? You didn't just awaken to the third tier, did you? No, second tier. Why?" "Legs, the name your skill changes into matters. I've never once heard of a second-tier skill with the word divine added to it, only third-tier ones. The system is basically saying your enchanting is good enough to be considered akin to a god's." He could only laugh as the crab said it. "I think the system just has a bit of a sense of humor then. I got a long way to go. Anyway, give me a minute, I've got a lot to think about." An awakened skill, a title, 2 new skills, one of which he was already feeling the changes from, and his job complete. There was a lot to think about and consider. He knew he'd be exploring the awakened skill in detail soon enough, and he could only hope that the title did something useful for him, so he focused on the 2 new skills. He couldn't be certain, but he thought that mental expansion felt akin to both parallel thought and complex mind in the extent it had just changed things in his head. If complex mind gave him more strands of thought that would arrange themselves into new minds in his head and parallel thought strengthened those strands, then he got the impression that mental expansion affected the breadth of his thoughts, letting a single mind hold bigger ideas and envision things in greater detail. He'd need to look into it to be sure, but it seemed like he'd just drifted even farther from the human standard for what was going on in his head. He was only grateful it hadn't left him passed out again. As for the other one, his new skill destruction, he had to assume it had come from enchanting, but he didn't immediately know what it might do. At the very least he knew it would be easy to level since, in theory, it would get all of the same bonuses that enchanting did, meaning his crafting jobs should cover it too. Now that it looked like he'd have time, he'd need to experiment with it, but that was an issue for later. He let himself slide down the wall until he was sitting, giving Greed a chance to keep healing him as he looked out into the room and thought for a bit. There really are 2 piles of stuff this time. Maybe my theory before was wrong then? I'd have expected less things to show up on each floor if it was collecting things from the people who died and putting them on the next one. But if my idea was wrong, then what was with all of the stuff that clearly came from this world? People couldn't just be leaving it behind, could they? God, there's too much to think about. I'll have to check it over, but first I need to wait and see if the enchantment I made before actually holds, or if I'm going to need to reapply it from time to time. And before that, he reached his hand into his pocket, letting the options fill his mind while at the same time being immensely grateful it had worked. He'd never heard of someone bringing a job crystal into a trial before, but given that the skill system wasn't impeded at all, it made sense the job system wouldn't be either. He made a mental note that he should try to learn more about how both worked as he let himself go over the options filling his head. Available jobs. Trap user. Craftsman alchemy path. Craftsman artistic path. Craftsman blacksmith path. Craftsman cooking path. Craftsman stonecrafts path. Craftsman sewing path. Heretic. Holy craftsman. Kin. Tank. A mathematician. Adventurer. Cursed item maker. Scholar. A master craftsman. A material mage. A master enchanter. Destruction mage. Well, I guess I got my answer about what the destruction skill does. Of the 2 new jobs on the list, he'd only expected one, having known he would unlock the master enchanter job after awakening the skill. The destruction mage job was a whole other bonus entirely. At the very least, it made sense when he thought about it. For a magic skill to be the bonus skill he got from awakening enchanting seemed reasonable enough given that it was technically a magic skill as well, and some of his earliest training with enchanting had focused on using its destructive properties as a way of carving statues. He'd need to test it out still, but he couldn't say he wasn't happy to get it, even if it did seem like it wouldn't be as useful to him as the material user skill seemed like it would be. "Whatcha got there?" Greed asked him as he used his healing magic, referring to the job crystal and pulling Ben from his thoughts. "Job crystal. If you complete yours while we're in here, let me know." Hearing that, Greed looked like he wanted to say something, but in the end only shook his head and got back to work treating Ben's many wounds, leaving him to think on just what to take. It was honestly tragic he hadn't taken the master craftsman job earlier. Even if awakening enchanting wouldn't have been nearly enough to get it complete the way it had for his true mage job, it would have been good experience and likely given him a few levels. Now though, given the situation they were in, he needed to think long and hard about just what he thought would give him the best chance he could have at surviving. All magic jobs are out. I have enough bonuses going to material user and destruction already that it would be a waste. And with enchanting just awakening, I don't think I'm going to be so lucky as to get a level anytime soon if I take master enchanter. All craftsman jobs are out too for the same reason. I want to survive this. What options do I have that might help? He eyed the heretic job, thinking about how improving the skill might help him considering he was in the trial of a god but ultimately decided against it. He just leveled the skill up, and its effects felt too vague to immediately be useful if he did. There was a chance adventure wouldn't be completely useless, but it really seemed more like a combat job than anything else, and he didn't see any immediate benefit to merging his job pool with Greed's. In the end, there was one option he felt reasonably sure of, even though it still seemed like a gamble. Taking a breath, he did something he'd never done before when selecting a job. He grasped the crystal in both of his hands, holding it tightly in front of his face as he closed his eyes and began to pray. Please, you great and powerful system on my soul. Do me a solid and give me something good with this. A skill, a level, anything to help out. If I was ever going to gain anything from this, now's the time. Feeling desperate, are you? Greed asked as he watched. If there was ever a situation to be called desperate, I think this is it. He continued to pray and hope despite the fact that he was sure nothing was listening, until he gave in and named his choice. I'll take tank. Name, Ben Hef. Race human. Titles, Apostle of Myriad, the Forgotten One, Miracle Maker, Skill Learner, Enemy of Aneth, Trial Defier. Jobs, Tank LV9. Previous jobs, Apprentice Craftsman, Craftsman, Priest, Enchanter, Mind User, Magic Item Maker, Magic Weapon Maker, High Enchanter, Fractured Mind User, Tree Tamer, High Craftsman, Apprentice Mage, True Mage. Attributes, a Vitality, 401. A Vitality recovery rate, 6 per hour.
Mana, 306.
Mana recovery rate, 19 per minute. Strength, 430. Agility, 161. Stamina, 1416. Intelligence, 1249. Affinities, Light 3. Life 2. Fire, 4. Water 3. Air, 4. Earth 2. Death 3. Dark 1. Space, 4. Time 5. Resistances, Light, 68. Life, 72. Fire, 75. Water, 69. Air, 66. Earth, 81. Death, 78. Dark, 85. Space, 63. Time, 61. Blessed skills. Unending crafting LV0 asterisk. Divine enchanting LV0 asterisk. Focus LV9. Passive skills. World Speak Plus. Tolerance LV6. Sacrilege LV7. Complex Mind LV6. A Bind. Partial Demonic Body. Defense Enhancement LV3. Parallel Thought LV5. Absorption Resistance LV2. Plant Knowledge LV4. A Mental Expansion LV0. Healing Enhancement LV0. All Affinity Resistance Enhancement LV0. Active Skills. Stealth LV1. Connect LV9. Hidden Mind LV7. Calculate LV4. Meditation LV3. Cycling LV0. Marksmanship LV0. Speed Reading LV3. Material User LV1.
Destruction LV0.
Blessings. Myriad's Blessing. Analia's Blessing. Hilori's Blessing. Trials. Trial of Analia and Talona. Holy crap, yes. He screamed out, throwing his arms in the air despite the pain. Ask and ye shall receive greed. I don't think that could have actually gone better. He'd been hoping desperately for levels in those skills given what he thought might be to come, or maybe to receive a new skill that could be useful, and it looked like the system was being merciful. Given the beatings he'd gone through, as well as the fact that he always remade his ring to make it take as much from him as he could safely manage, he'd thought he must have been close to getting levels in both anyway, but the new skills were a whole other matter. Not only a skill that improved his ability to heal, but also one that improved all of his resistances. Ever since he'd learned about that particular class of skill, he'd known that in theory at least he had a good compatibility with them thanks to his naturally high resistances. Combining that with both the title that gave him better odds of acquiring rare skills and the job that he never expected he'd actually take, and he was golden. There was just one small concern it brought along with it. Hey Greed, I don't suppose you felt any difference healing me now, do you? No, why? Got a new skill, but if it's not interfering yet, then it's fine. So I guess the boost to my natural healing rate is making it just easier enough for light and life magic to do their thing that the increase in difficulty from my resistance enhancement is cancelled out. I guess I'm gonna have to try and make sure those level at the same rate to keep things from getting too bad for me, though the ideal would be to raise the healing enhancement more. There were a lot of things to think about for all of it. If he was right about the trial, then there was a good chance that it was going to be a struggle to keep both skills leveling at the same rate, but that was a worry for later. More important was what else his new skill meant. He had something else he could use for the braces now, at least as long as he got out. He let the hours pass, barely moving as greed healed him. He briefly checked how his awakened enchanting would work with Connect and was disappointed to see that he'd been right. He couldn't do anything with Greed's blessing magic. With that sad discovery made, he had no choice but to focus on his magics to pass the time, using the knife from before to figure out exactly what his destruction skill could do. It actually wasn't that hard. Once he knew it was a magic skill and that it came from his enchanting, all he did was consider the point where they were related and flooded the item with mana, feeling it turn to dust in his hand like it would any time he'd gone too far with an enchantment. The mana cost was far higher than if he did it the way he normally would, but it was quicker too, giving him plenty of possibilities where it could be used. Once he was holding nothing but a metallic powder, he switched to Material User, changing the consistency of the dust he held and forcing it to blend back together into a single solid clump of metal. He repeated it a few times too before he began testing other things. He learned that he could use the skill to destroy parts of the metal without touching it, though that resulted in such a sharp rise in its mana cost that he marked that off as unviable, at least at his current level. He also figured out that he could use it to destroy less physical things as well, breaking down an enchantment he'd put on the block, but as with every other test, at a higher mana cost than how he'd typically do it. He kept going for as long as he could, but by the 6-hour mark of practicing he had to get up. "Hey legs, get back down here, I'm almost done. If it's nothing that won't heal on its own, then I'll let my body deal with it itself. It's probably better to raise my new skill anyway. Besides, I need to deal with this." He'd been keeping an eye on the enchantment he'd put on the trial, and it had just broken. He didn't want to lose another second to that countdown if he could help it. So he placed his hands against the wall to add it again, feeling himself connect with his rings as the mana left him and seeing it hold. Now, will that last longer? The enchantment is better, but I don't know if it broke because of the other enchantment pushing against it or if there's a different reason it was destroyed. I'll keep an eye on it either way. He left it for the time being, going to the other end of the room where the entrance to the next section stood and began looking over the enchantments that could be seen there and swore. "Bad news. I think one of my theories was right." "Well, mind sharing with the rest of us which one?" "I'm pretty sure the theme of the next section is going to be water." "You aren't seriously saying we're going to have to go through 8 more of these freaking things?" "It's looking more and more like this is the trial of a god of magic, so I'd say probably. Also, if I'm right, it will probably be 9, not 8, though I really hope I'm wrong." "What are you talking about? There's only 10 magics." Greed trailed off as he understood what Ben was saying and began to swear, cursing out a god who was no longer there to listen. Ben couldn't disagree. If they were exceptionally lucky, then the 11th floor would be where they would claim their rewards, but he wasn't feeling that lucky, nor was he willing to bet on the generosity of the god who'd made that trial. As far as he was concerned, they were going to have to deal with a non-affinitied floor. He couldn't begin to express just how much he hated the idea, in part because that left it impossible to plan. Non-affinitied magics were typically harder to use and had a larger mana cost, but for the trial of a god that would be meaningless. Then there was the problem of just how flexible non-affinitied magics were. Looking at the examples he possessed alone, there was enchanting, material user, and destruction, all of which were plenty varied in their own way, but then there were so many others too. Clairvoyance, strengthening, magic nullification, corpse song, telekinesis, empathy, the list went on and on, with many options being extremely rare. Whatever the trial contained would reflect whatever uses the god and its people had found for magic like that, but in principle it could be used for almost anything. Okay, no point worrying about this now, he told himself. Let's just survive the next bit. "I don't suppose you can breathe underwater?" "Thankfully I do well in both land and sea," Greed told him, casting him a more concerned look. "And you? I don't suppose your race is built for that sort of thing, is it?" "No, I'm not." He knew there were water and air affinity skills that might help him, but there was no way for someone like him to gain them. It was the curse of his garbage affinities. He'd need another option if it was going to be anything like the air trial. He looked to the pile of items in the corner, having a small idea but needing to sort them all out first before he did so. He went to examine the 2 piles, finding the larger of the 2 to be surprising as he did. "This one's all the stuff from the last section. Does it just keep bringing them forward after?" "Why though?" "You know what, no, I'm not going to question whatever little bit of kindness I can get here. This is good news." "What about the other one?" He looked through it the same as he did on the last floor, finding mostly the same items as he did. Nothing greater than lower rare, with most of them having fragmented and decaying enchantments. The few that were whole were just of the magic variety. Nothing worth copying onto a ring for later. Of everything he saw, the only thing he felt that was worth his time was 5 more items from the race that made the trail, and he put them to the side to study later. He was going to make use of everything around he could, starting with every piece of metal available to him as he grabbed a sword and walked over behind the fountain, turning it to dust and then reassembling it into a flat sheet of metal. "Greed, hope you're ready to be pushed a bit. Between this and keeping the timer stopped, I'm going to need a hell of a lot of buffs." "Ha, call me a prophet. 'cause I can already see what my future looks like until we get out of here. So what are you making now? If the next trial is actually water, then I want to prepare the best I can. That means making things, testing things, and hopefully getting a new skill. That means I need a pool. Here's hoping there's no limit on the fountain. Building it by hand, constantly expanding his mana as he did while buffed to all hell and then having to actually fill it up. It was going to be far from easy, but now he had all of the time in the world. He'd already sworn to himself he would live. What was just a little work to make it happen? I can't believe that took me over a freaking week, Ben complained as he got himself out of the pool he'd made. The Zeroth level he'd managed on the first day, but the first he'd only gotten more than a week later, having used the better part of each day doing it. I wasn't even a bad swimmer on Earth. Sure, I didn't do it a lot, but I at least knew what I was doing. Why did it take so freaking long to get to level 1? He'd originally hoped to get to level 2 before considering doing the next section of the trial, but from the looks of it, that could end up taking a couple months. They could survive that time thanks to Ben applying enchantments to the trial every 6 hours, with the structure seeming to have some sort of self-correcting mechanism that removed them after that period. But with 9 more sections to go through, if they took that much time, it could still mean being stuck in there for over a year, maybe multiple. They didn't want to rush through it, but they didn't want to be trapped forever either. He got out and dried himself off with some of the old clothing around, not bothering to get dressed as he did. The difference in body structure was too great between him and Greed for him to be bothered by it, and he was going to be having to deal with it for the trial soon enough anyway, as he did a final check of the equipment he'd been making when he wasn't busy working on his swimming. Really, the swimming was an emergency backup in the event that what he truly believed in, not his oh-so-fallible body but the tools he'd made with it, somehow failed him. The first and most important item was the sea scooter he'd made, a handheld propeller with far too many of the safety features one would expect in such an item removed in the name of speed. It ran through an application of earth and water enchantments to rotate the blade at levels he wouldn't be comfortable having anywhere near his face if it weren't for the fact that the alternative was drowning and had his only white mana crystal built into it to help with powering it, though his own buffed power supply would do plenty for it as well. In addition to that though, and as far as he was concerned just as important, it would deploy a barrier around it to protect the front of his body. Water magic could easily mean ice after all, and he wouldn't want to smash into any head first. Then there were the items he only considered marginally less important, if alone for the fact that he had done everything he could to ensure that he had backups on backups for them. His means of surviving being submerged. Ever since he and Greed got to that little rest area, he'd barely been sleeping because of just how much he had to do, with one of his tasks being making as many airtight spatial bags as he could by combining some of the discarded fabrics and metals with his material magic and blowing them each up like a balloon before fitting them all inside one another, leaving him with a single bag in the end that attached to a mask with a few different features built in. He'd made them the best he could, but he had to admit he'd done it too early. Since they weren't made using anything that supplied mana, he had to top them up each day, lest any of them burst as a result of the amount of space within shrinking while the amount of air stayed the same. On the more positive side, they showed just how incredible his ability to make spatial enchantments had become. Even when he'd been at the 7th enchanting level, he was sure he wouldn't have been able to make anything better than the bags he already had, and until now he hadn't considered it. There had always been something else for him to think about, but it was one of the better points of just how skilled he'd become. Each bag had been the size of the one he usually used, but with over 5 times the space, even without an affinity tied to it. If he survived, he'd be having a much more profitable avenue for making money as he sold them, but that was a concern for much later. Still, they were only an emergency feature. His true tool for surviving the depths would be something he had to make by not only pulling the 3 different branches of enchanting he used together, but also some of the knowledge he'd been getting from Quillith. The alien had been devoted to doing exactly what he said he would, teaching Ben material science, brushing him off any time he questioned just how much was actually applicable to the field. More and more what he was learning felt like biology or physics compared to the chemistry of the universe, but now he couldn't help but be grateful that the Grey had felt the need to go beyond the boundary of what they'd initially agreed on. It let him make something to turn the water around him into air. It was more complicated than simply splitting the liquid's base components, but what mattered was it worked. To Greed's displeasure, He tested it out as soon as it was done, but suffered no ill effects for the experience, even after a couple hours under. That was still short compared to how long he might find himself there, but it gave him the faith he needed that it would work. That just leaves the ice. He thought to himself, reaching into a cooler he'd made and pulling out a block, looking it over in his hand and applying the effects of destruction to it, feeling it turn to snow in an instant. He'd gotten his magic to level 1, but there was a chance they'd actually need it if they came across any ice barrier. As tempting as a fire enchantment would be, anything he could think of to use against it would be all but useless underwater. Of course, I'm gonna feel like a real freaking idiot if our guess here is wrong. It just made so much sense to him. The air one had him falling through the sky, why wouldn't the water one have him swimming through it? But there was always the possibility that he was completely off the mark, that whatever God made the trial had a completely different concept about what a water section should be. A part of him wanted to laugh as he thought about the difference from his first trial in Analia. That time he hadn't bothered to learn enough when he knew he was going into it and suffered for his ignorance, while this time he learned everything he could about it, thinking he had been learning for pure intellectual curiosity, and it still wasn't enough. Well, at least for this bit I've done all I can. He looked down at Greed beside him as he packed his jacket within the bag, along with the job crystal. He didn't want to risk being wrong about it appearing in the next rest area. It was too important to let it get lost, so it was secured in place, tightly bound to the back of his bag. "All right, are you ready?" he asked, knowing his companion would be far more important than him for this. Greed's eyes were suited for seeing through water in a way his weren't, which meant he was in charge of finding the light of the exit. "As I'll ever be. And you remember what to do in an emergency?" "Unfortunately," he said as he tapped a metal ring that was tightly bound around his claw against the ground. "You sure you want to do something so crazy?" "There's not one thing I'm doing here that isn't crazy, man. If the choice is certain death or a coin flip on if we live or die, I'll at least take the coin flip." Fine. Let's just get this over with." Ben picked up his companion and secured him to the back of his neck tightly so they wouldn't get separated, letting Greed steer him in a way they'd already figured out as they went, as well as giving him a way to touch the spatial bag if things got desperate. There was always a chance that something would make it hard to communicate using his connect skill while they were down there, so just in case it was at his sole discretion if he was going to use their final option, but Ben chose to place his faith in the little crab. With the situation they were in, all they could believe in was each other. As they stepped through the door and found themselves immediately being crushed by the force of water around them, Ben couldn't help but be a little satisfied he got it right, even if it was objectively bad news for them, as he tightly gripped the overpowered sea scooter he'd created, feeling its powerful blade all too close to his face as they went through the depths with him doing his best to keep his breathing calm. There was more visibility than he'd been expecting from the trial, but only a little. He could see a couple meters in front of his face, but that was it. And with nothing coming from Greed, he had no choice but to wander aimlessly through the depths, looking for any glimmer of light that stood out to them. For the first little while nothing happened, but that left them on edge more than anything else as they wondered just what was about to be thrown at them, with Ben connecting to Greed as he sat pressed against his flesh. Anything at all? A light, something to worry about? Impending death not too far away? Ben asked, feeling antsy from the situation as he wondered just what else would be thrown their way. Not yet. Hopefully not at all. Things won't stay this easy. Won't stop me from hoping, though. Greed thought back with a laugh. He kept the connection open as they went through the depths, not wanting to miss anything as they went, even if they moved in silence. They both needed their full attention in case anything happened, until Greed spoke up. "Did you feel that? Unfortunately, looks like we've got some freaking water currents. Oh joy." Ben couldn't help but think sarcastically. If we compare it to the first trial where we got the wind slowly getting stronger, I'm sure we'll get the same thing here. Think we'll get a whirlpool instead of a tornado in that case? The thought hung between them as they kept going. As annoying as the currents were, with his tool in hand they were all but harmless to them, at least for the time being. They got stronger as time went on, but not so much as to be unmanageable, and Ben couldn't help but feel worried by it. Things had been going too smoothly. He was so tense from worry that he didn't even notice what was happening at first until things started to click. He was cold. Greed, on a scale of 1 to 10, how cold are you right now? Maybe a 5? My kind can handle the temp pretty well, what about you? A 7, and when we got here I'd say I was a 4. Gods above, what are you thinking? I'm thinking it's pretty weird that in all of our time here I haven't seen a single bit of ice yet, and I'm really not liking the implications. He still wore his rings and quickly built a fire enchantment into the handle's metal sea scooter he was holding to help his hands, making it far hotter than he'd need to in preparation for what was likely to come. Even if he'd taken the precaution of securing himself to it, he couldn't be too careful. Losing it was as dangerous for him as losing anything else without the exit in either of their sights. He began to meditate, using every level he had of the skill for each of his minds, remembering that it would be used as a way to handle the cold back on his old world by daredevils and performers, letting his heart rate and breathing slow as he did. Things were only getting colder with each passing minute, and while it was starting to be bad, he didn't think it was dangerous yet. His skin was beginning to sting, but he ignored that too. The only real issue came when his scooter started slowing down. He roused half of his minds, trying to grasp the problem and finding it quickly enough. Water would freeze around nucleating points first, meaning his tools and them, though their body heat was providing some protection for the time. The thin layer of frost forming around the item he held was a whole other matter. In seconds he had built a new enchantment onto the tool, a fire one that completely covered it instead of just helping his hands, but at that point the change could be felt in all of the endless ocean. Flecks of ice were appearing everywhere, slowly rising up from the depths as the water started to freeze. It was getting colder faster, and hope was quickly vanishing with it as they went. It was only as he felt a signal from Greed that he realized he accidentally dropped the connection at one point, reactivating it as he went where he was directed. Down. Sorry. Ben told him. I think this might be getting to me. You see something? All I can say is I think so. It's real dim though, so it might not be quick to get there. You gonna be okay? I'll have to be. I'll pour as much as I can into it. He dumped all the mana he had to spare into his tool, giving them a burst of speed while he could, the flecks of ice around them growing bigger as they plunged into the depths and bounced against the barrier in front of him. As their speed rose, his body began rebelling against him despite the desperation of the situation. He was going too deep too fast. The pressure was building and everything ached. His stomach felt like it was tearing itself apart, and it felt as though his ears had been stabbed, but he kept going. He had no way of knowing if they were close except for Greed's encouragement. Even if they were, it would have been impossible to tell. His vision was blocked with bigger and bigger chunks of ice, many the size of fists and only growing larger as they went. It was getting hard to think or even hear Greed, and the crab knew it. Just before he felt himself begin to fade away entirely, he heard the scream in his mind from the connection he was desperately trying to keep in place. Cancel the scooter and tilt to your body to your right. Now. With his last bit of strength, and as the world began going black, he did as he was told. Turning off his tool and moving his body as Greed took the Morabugel ring Ben had reshaped to fit his claw and pressed it against the spatial bag filled to the brim of other bags of air, ripping the mana from it and causing it all to burst out at a designed weak point and creating a powerful explosion of air. Even though it happened right against his body, Ben couldn't feel it. He was too numb by that point. All he could do was hope that Greed's aim had been true as he shot through the abyss, either to live or meet his cold end. Ben opened his eyes, still cold and wet but thankfully on the floor of the next rest area. Greed already working on healing him as he laid there. He worried about how long he'd been out but cast a look to the area of the wall he knew the countdown would be and saw it was only a few hours. So how's it look, Greed? Am I losing any limbs to frostbite? A couple of your toes were looking bad, so I worked on them first. You should keep everything. I'm more surprised your fingers look fine. I modified the scooter on the fly when I realized what was happening. What about the rest of me? What's the damage? He was afraid to move and look at himself. Like each other time he'd finished a section, the pain was intense, making him wonder if he'd ever get so lucky as to gain the pain resistance skill. His biggest concern was how they'd gotten out though. By having Greed forcefully rip the mana from the nesting spatial bags he'd set up, he'd more or less created a bomb right against his body. He didn't think it would be pretty, even if the fact that he could still feel his limbs was a good sign. Shockingly, though, his companion actually had some good news for him. Looks like your fancy jacket you packed away saved you from most of the damage. At least that's my best guess. I'll tell you, Legs, you really live a little too on the edge. Ha, we're alive, aren't we? Just let me know when I'm good enough to stand. I want to add my enchantment and then figure out what sort of hell we're dealing with next. You can probably move now, though I doubt you'll like it much. Do what you need to and I'll finish up after. He'd actually hoped he would have been made to lie down longer. But with his healer's consent given, he forced himself up and applied the enchantment to the trial again. He felt the size of his mind's increase and breathed a happy sigh as he did. The enchantment was still difficult for him. He needed to keep the entire thing in his thoughts at once before placing it. So the added wiggle room to his mind felt like a blessing as he moved to the pile of items that had been left there. He hadn't given any thought to what would happen to the entire pool he'd created, but it had been brought to the next rest area, water and all. He didn't need it now that the water section was done with, but it had a light and death enchantment on it to keep the water from growing stagnant and an earth one to keep it from rusting, so he could always make use of it later if he wanted. At worst, I can just break it down and use it for parts. He moved on to look at the rest of what was there. It seemed that everything that hadn't gone into making the pool was still there, though the items from the last two trials had been tossed together into a single pile, with a newer, much smaller one present for this area. As each pile they saw shrank, it stood as a marker for just how many people actually survived. But as depressing as it was, he'd need to go through it later. For the time being, he grabbed some old clothing left in the first pile to dry himself off with before grabbing a couple broken chunks of metal to practice his magics with as he waited for Greed to finish treating him before he wandered over to the doorway of the next section, doing his best to contain a scream as he did. So we're probably in a fair amount of trouble because the next section is going to be fire. He yelled out to the waiting crab, who only seemed defeated by the news, even if he tried to be optimistic. Maybe it won't be so bad? I'd say the past three are evidence to the contrary, Ben told him dryly, already thinking on how he might prepare. Well, what's the worst-case scenario? We're tossed into the heart of a star, or at least the closest thing the god who made this place can replicate. What's the second worst scenario then? I don't know, Greed. I wasn't expecting this guy to try to freeze an entire ocean with us in it. Who knows what sort of crap this maniac is going to do next? At this point, I feel fairly sure that the guy who made this was actually an evil god who thought it would be funny to mess with a world already in peril. We also need something to call him other than that guy, or the god. Greed looked thoughtful for a moment, trying to find the perfect name to sum up his feelings for what they'd had to go through. I vote Assface. Assface works for me. The notification rang out in his head as he was practicing his magic while having his mana heavily buffed. If he had to be stuck there with anyone, Greed was the best option. Even if being buffed kept him from raising the attributes under the buffs effect as he practiced, having all that extra mana and Regan was doing great things for training his actual skills themselves. With a mana pool already larger than he ever could have hoped for without a couple years of sleeping with his cursed ring, the increase that awakened blessing magic could temporarily provide still felt substantial. If I'm in here long enough, maybe I'll even catch up to Thera's magic level. He thought with a laugh as he imagined how annoyed she might be, even if she was happy for him in the end. As that bit of amusement ended, though, it was replaced with sorrow and worry. Would he ever see her again? Would he see any of the people he'd grown to care about in the world? When he'd first gotten there, he'd felt so alone as he'd been the only one left unwanted. But slowly he'd built his life, finding people to care about and making his place in the world. The thought he might not get to see any of them again was horrifying. Don't think about it. Stressing wouldn't help him, not when there was so much else to do. He needed to try and anticipate whatever the trial was going to throw at him next and figure out how to create countermeasures for it on top of improving his skills as much as he could. He didn't have a forge he could rely on for making things, meaning he needed to master his new magics to get them to the point that he could make anything he might need to keep them alive. It was with that frame of mind that he walked over to the newest pile of goods, eager to see what there might be. While the first pile had been huge with hundreds of things and the one that had come after was still more than half its size, this one had shrunk considerably. He wasn't so optimistic as to assume that it was because more people were making it through so there were less items to be had though. It was likely the opposite, that too many people had died early on, meaning that he'd already seen most of what there was to be pilfered. On the more positive side of things though, the items he was seeing now were much better. Sure, there were still the bloodied clothes and broken bits of armor and weapons, but he was now seeing items in the mid-rare range of the ranking spectrum, though still lacking any useful enchantments for him to try copying. More important than that though was what he immediately recognized as two spatial bags, both extremely high quality and one having a time enchantment bound to it. Neither were as good as what he could currently make after awakening his enchanting, and the time enchantment wasn't of a level high enough to freeze the time within it. But that didn't change his excitement about what might be inside. Without any care he ripped them both open, feeling his eyes gleam as he did. Both were in a bad state. He was sure that they had each contained food that had been there so long it had rotten away to dirt, covering everything inside, but he couldn't care less about that. They weren't so old that the enchantments on them had become useless, and more importantly, they were receiving power, meaning they were made with mithril. He dumped their contents and sorted them with everything else he'd seen, tossing them all to the side as he did. The first bag was useless to him except for the small bit of the precious metal it was made from, but the second was far more exciting. It contained plenty of things that he would have no personal use for: a magic lighter, a canteen that could refill itself, and rotted-away rations to name a few, but most important by far was a small shield with an earth and barrier enchantment applied to it, with a small white mana crystal built into it. "Oh, thank God," he said as he sighed contently. "So now we have 2 mana crystals and some mithril, so whatever I make I won't have to spend as much of my own mana on." "No, that's not right. I'll just have more mana to spend overall and might be able to make some things without needing to worry about juggling my output for multiple items at once. This is good. This is real good." Even if things were still tight for his magic materials, at the very least he wasn't low on other resources. All that was left was figuring out what he needed to make. "Holy crap!" Ben yelled out as he caught sight of a certain area of the trial's enchantments briefly activate. "There's no freaking way, that should be impossible." "What?" Greed yelled in a panic as he sat in Ben's hand, eating the only source of food available to him. "Don't tell me we're in trouble again?" "Oh, no, sorry. I just saw something I really wasn't expecting. That food the trial provides? If I'm right, it looks like it makes it straight from mana." "And that's so shocking you need to scream?" the crab asked with a groan. "Legs, I know you like your research, but come on." "Greed, if you could see the enchantments and studied magic a bit more you'd understand just how insane this is. The trial materialized it from non-affinitied mana." Ben was no stranger to seeing something materialized at this point. It was how Thera's father had made the nation of Analia so wealthy. Along with doing it from the earth affinity, Ben knew for sure it was possible to do for the water affinity and was positive it could be done for air magic as well, though there was simply no need to, and it would be hard to determine if a person succeeded since air was all around them at all times. As well, fire and light affinities both seemed able to turn mana into energy, though at a lower mana cost and without any way of being certain that was what was going on. This was different thought. He'd never heard of non-affinitied magic being able to do such a thing, nor had he heard about anyone setting up an enchantment that would be able to automatically alter the structure of mana like that. He couldn't help himself as he rushed over to get a better look. All right, I get you're excited, but what's the big deal?" Greed asked, willing to take any sort of entertainment after all of the time he spent doing nothing but healing Ben and waiting for him to get to the point where they would enter the next section. "Is it really so amazing?" "It absolutely is. Greed, part of the mana cost of materialization depends on how well a person understands the properties of what they're materializing. For any awakened earth mage that has the skill, they'll typically just make a lump of iron since it's a pure material, and they'll have their affinity to bring down the cost as well. For this, Assface had to somehow encode knowledge into the structure of the enchantment itself, while using a magic that, as far as I know, is never put to this sort of task, or if it is manages to be such a fringe case that it's not even talked about, as well as making something as nightmarishly complicated as food. Think you might be overestimating food a little, especially the crap you're being served," Greed said with a laugh. "It's just some poisoned bread." Just because it's poison for you doesn't mean it's poisoned for most people. And I cannot stress enough how much you're underestimating food. It's got a complex structure made of multiple elements, with the way they're arranged being the difference between biting into bread and biting into a rock. Aside from the fact that if I could put this on an item, then nobody would ever starve from a bad harvest again, the level of complexity might let this trial do insane things like create life. Wait. Don't tell me you think we're going to have to deal with monsters in this thing. Do you? Greed asked, his mild curiosity quickly flipping to despair. No, I'd say that it could probably create microbes if it can at all, but that's still something we should worry about when we get to the life section of this. Actually, I'd say the biggest concern now by far is if there really is a non-affinitied section. Do I even want to know why? Greed, the jerk that made this, is doing things with non-affinitied mana I didn't even know were possible. I'm not going to pretend I'm an expert or anything on the subject, but I'm pretty damn well read. The god that made this has to have mastered it in ways I couldn't begin to imagine, meaning that there's no way for me to even start to guess what a trial devoted to it might contain. After his discovery, Ben spent almost a full day looking over that section, memorizing the arrangements of the enchantments as he studied it in the hopes that he would be able to take the knowledge out of the trial with him as he went for whatever good it might do. He poked and prodded it, trying to determine what parts did what, and eventually learned how to stimulate it, forcing the trial to give them more food than it normally wanted to, leading to more discoveries as he went. Hey Greed? Not sure if you know much about trials in general, do you? Probably the average amount. Why? That's fine. So you know all trials have limits to how many people can take them at once. You mean as part of the same group, right? The crab asked, getting a nod in return. Yeah, it varies a bit, but the higher end is typically around 5, right? At least that's what all of the magic towers max out at. In the trial of Analia, it had been teams of 2 per entrance, no more, no less, but that could vary as they went. Some had lower limits of what was allowed, but most only had upper limits, restricting just how many people could work together to complete a task. Yeah, well, as I was looking at this, I think the trial marks how many living things enter it to determine how many rations to hand out when it gives them. Ben started, feeling uneasy as he did. We're marked as 2, but I think I figured out the upper limit for this one. Out with it, legs. You're freaking me out here. 27. The god that made this trial made it so up to 27 people could take it at once. The silence hung between them as it was said. Neither of them had heard of a trial on the world allowing anything close to that number of people in at once, and they didn't like the implications of it one bit. So what does that mean for us then? Greed asked, feeling worn out just hearing it. Ultimately, not much. It doesn't help us, and it doesn't put us in a worse position either, at least not worse than we already are. It's just the implications of it that are a little troubling. Gods typically set the maximum as what they expect mortals to struggle with completing. I've heard gods give slightly better rewards if less manage it, but, well, if the expectation for getting through this is a team of 27, I don't really like the implications. Got any good news for us while you're at it? With the way you keep poring over the walls, I could sure use some. I'm not sure if it's good news, but I'm working on a bit of a theory. An alternative we could use to finishing the trial if we really want to. Wait, really? Yeah, the only small issue is that it might kill us. You really know how to get a guy's hopes up. You know that? The crab complained. So out with it then. What's your idea? So I don't know how well known this is, but you know how items have rankings? I'd say that's pretty common knowledge, yeah? I'm not talking about that bit. See, things of a certain level of power can't exist on this plane of reality. For items, upper mythic is as high as things go, and I'm told that a trial is the equivalent of one, carefully balanced by the gods to be just weak enough to exist on the world. Okay, the crab said cautiously, wondering where this was leading. The thing is, I think it's a pretty delicate balance depending on how these things are made. It's just a theory, but I think if I forcibly activate enough of the enchantments that make this up at once, it might be enough to force it past its current rank and shift us up to a higher plane of existence. And that would help us how? Hypothetically, if we ended up in the realm of the gods, they might actually be able to get us out. I know they've been weakened in a way that makes it hard to exert their presence on the world as a whole without taking some pretty big steps, but in their own realms they might just be able to crack this thing open. I'm liking what I'm hearing so far, so stop raising my hopes and give me the bad news already. Where do I begin? It's not like there's only 2 layers to this reality. Hell, if you've ever gone through the gate, you've gone to a slightly higher one, and on the opposite end of the spectrum you have a lower one like the infinite hells. That's already 4 different planes, and I have no idea how many more there are. We could be bumped up a reality only slightly, not shifting to anywhere we could get help but to some empty realm. Of course, there's always the chance that we would fall back to our current one once the trial corrects anything I do to it, but there's really no way to know for sure, so it's a big risk. Just as importantly, though, I don't know if we could even survive being in the realm of gods. His mind went there plenty as Myriad brought him there, and he could force his consciousness there without any issues, but that was just his mind. He had no idea if his physical body could exist there, nor did he want to think about what might happen if it couldn't. Still, it was an option, and as such he wanted his companion to be aware of it. When you put it that way, I'm not sure I like that idea any more than I like going through the proper one. Any chance you've got a secret third option hidden away for us? Ha, if only. I think I'd need to figure out a bit more anyway to give it any chance of working. But what do you say? Should we take the risk? Greed stood quiet for a moment, thinking it over and weighing options before he spoke up. I don't really like the risk that we could do it, only to be thrown to a different plane and still need to complete the trial to get out of here. What do you say we keep it as a maybe and consider again after the next section? Works for me. As Ben finished laying down an enchantment, he felt the suit of armor he'd carefully constructed with his magic crumble in his hands, leaving him all the more annoyed at his current situation. He had so many different advantages that should have made a problem like that basically non-existent. He was now the proud holder of the divine enchanting skill which had boosted his previous ability to all new heights, as well as the knowledge he'd gained from the enchanting system of the trial, which added a level of structure and stability to the way he did things that it had previously lacked. In theory, he should have been able to make things miles beyond what he had previously, if not for a single thing holding him back: the materials. Ben had no choice but to make use of anything in the room with him, much to his annoyance. That meant he couldn't blend the metals at his disposal with other things to enhance their effects or handle the enchantments he put on them, which in turn meant he had no choice but to keep making more armor to place them on again, at least until he was sure it would be impossible. At least I'm not losing anything when the item breaks now, he thought to himself as he swept together the dust of his third failure, taking the time to recombine it all into a single mass of metal before he flattened and shaped it all to match his needs. Since he was basically treating the metal as if it were clay and sculpting away it was still gaining the benefits of his awakened crafting as well. It was clear enough to see as he looked at it. His hands moved exactly as they needed to in order to get the look he was hoping for, and the end result was perfect. A full set of armor that would completely cover him when it came time to don it, but he still couldn't help but wish he had access to his hammer and forge as he did. If he had, he was sure he could have reached all new heights, but it wasn't to be. Or maybe I could, he thought as he cast a look to the remaining items around. No reason I can't sculpt a hammer and forge and put a good fire enchantment on it. If this one fails too, I'll give it a go. With the armor ready, Ben placed his hands on it and began building his enchantments in a way unlike anyone else in the world would. Starting with his blending as he always did to get the desired power and effect. He then had to not only shape the rings as he'd learned to during his time in there, but looped each one around another, creating a compounded weave of mana in each one he laid down. It was harder and more mana intense than how he'd been doing it before ending up trapped within the trial, but not so much that he wouldn't be able to do it, even without Greed's buffs. More important than that though, he didn't need to build it all at once like he had been each time he'd make one to affect the trial as a whole. He could work at his own pace, building it up as he went until it was done. He held his breath as he watched and waited, but the enchantment held, along with the armor he'd put it on. He couldn't stop the relief from flowing through him as it did either, but he double-checked his enchantments to be sure they would work. His skills were telling him he'd broken into lower ultra-rare with it, his third item that had made it to that quality and only his second that hadn't used anything as exceptional as his coat had, and given the complexity of the magic he'd placed on it, he wasn't surprised. The armor was made with every defensive skill at his disposal, including taking the fire aspect of his new skill, all affinity resistance enchantment, But it was so much more than that too. It was not only also built to have a small barrier projected from it with all of the previous skills incorporated into it as well, it also had a water enchantment added to it to constantly cool not only the armor, but the small space between it and the barrier to cool down anything that got through as well. Finally, and just as important as anything else, was the time magic enchantment on it, designed to affect its wearer, namely him. It was built to speed up the way he experienced time, not only letting him move and react faster, but as a side effect it would make anything he encountered seem slower too. It was brilliant, and he was patting himself on the back as soon as he thought of it, while ignoring the voice in his head asking why he hadn't come up with something so useful much earlier, and as he added the mana crystals to power it he slipped it on, activating the enchantments and immediately feeling the effects. Hope you do all right in the cold greed. Hey! I wasn't the one who was dying after the last trial. True. Actually, haven't you come out way too well in all of the sections so far compared to me? Where's the fairness, man? Blame yourself for not being blessed with a magnificent shell. Not that it's going to help much this one. Are you sure you're ready? I hear being cooked to death is pretty damn unpleasant. At least I'd say ready as we'll ever be. He did have his concerns. Considering the air and water trials had tossed them into those elements without much else, he still worried that fire would do the same. If he was tossed in a never-ending void of flame, then there wasn't much he could do about that. He'd considered adding an air enchantment to the suit as well as a way to allow for some flight, but the mana cost of such a thing would have left them running on empty so fast that it was more likely to hurt than help. Just gotta hope for the best. The Earth section had breathable air instead of just tossing us into a rock. I've gotta assume at least parts of this are survivable according to the race it was meant for. Of course, if they were naturally able to fly. He shook the thought from his head and picked up Greed before shoving him into the suit. You going to be okay not seeing much this time? He asked the crab, getting an all too positive response. Legs, you wouldn't believe how much happier I am not seeing what you're about to go through. If we live you can give me a rundown of what I missed after. But for now just tell me if you need any buffs refreshed or healing anywhere. Will do. It was with that final bit of confirmation that Ben lowered his helmet to protect his face and stepped through the door, into whatever the trial had to offer. Stepping into the trial, he was actually given a few reasons to feel optimistic. There was in fact solid ground for him to walk on, though it seemed more like a construct of mana than stone or earth beneath his feet, and his enchantments were holding. More than that, he was actually too cold from them and lowered their output until he was comfortable, knowing that in all likelihood he'd need to change them again soon enough. Even if it wasn't too bad so far, it was still hot, it just wasn't starting at a temperature that would cook him alive. From there, he took a quick look around, trying to figure out where he needed to go when a sight stopped him in his tracks. Greed, either I'm dreaming of the trials messing with me, 'cause I already see a light. It was nothing but a twinkle in the distance, and he was already sure it would take as many hours of suffering to reach as any other part of the trial they'd been through yet. But he was sure it was there, clear as day. One of his bigger concerns had been how he'd be able to find the thing if the trial was going to be flooded in flame, with light in all directions to mess him up. But so long as it wasn't a bit of fire already started, it might have been their first bit of good news so early into a section so far. Well then don't turn your nose up at a bit of mercy and get moving. Greed yelled at him, getting him moving with all of his speed. The armor was weighing him down, but his strength and stamina were both high, raised all the more thanks to the crab pressed into his chest, and combined with the time enchantment on the armor flooding him with its effects, he was all but flying across the land, making distance at a speed he could never normally hope to achieve. With every step he got farther as the world moved in slow motion, and he couldn't help but harbor a hope that he'd make it there before things got truly bad. His only concern being adjusting the water enchantment to keep things cool as the heat rose. That hope lasted right until a pillar of fire exploded from the ground only seconds later. He hadn't been expecting it. He couldn't have expected it. He'd been looking out into the distance, thinking he'd see the first sign of whatever was being thrown at him much farther away to give him at least a hint. But it had appeared right under his feet, briefly engulfing him in flames as it did. It was large enough that it took him seconds to get out, but by the end he felt himself sweating despite the various enchantments from him. He wished it was from worry or fear, but enough warmth had gotten through to leave him in that state as he went on, swearing to himself as he did. This is on me. We kept seeing signs at least a little bit away. I thought I could depend on it. Never expected to be thrown into the middle of a freaking inferno. Damn it, if those things only get hotter too, then I'm in trouble. As he tried to think of how he might be able to avoid such things in the future, there was one thing he didn't account for: his current speed and horrid luck. With the time enchantment on top of the previous buffs, he was moving much faster, meaning he'd gotten farther into the trial. The reason he hadn't seen any yet was because that was the first one. The fact that he had ended up in the center of it when it went off had all come down to poor chance, while the fact that he'd lived was thanks to the work he'd put in to prepare for it. Ben, having no idea of any of that, rushed on as he went, doing his best to be vigilant but seeing no warning that would give away the coming flame. All he could do to try to be safe was to lower the temperature further, going beyond what he was comfortable with to try and protect against anything that might catch them unaware. He watched more pillars shoot up around him, each one seeming to be larger than the last and erupting without warning, but thankfully missing him as they did. They were beginning to come faster though, with more appearing at once, so he tried to push himself harder, forcing more speed out of his legs with every step he went, only to find he couldn't. The first few sections had been making him grow accustomed to giving every drop of sweat and blood he could when he pushed his body, and when he started running for this one he was already forcing his body to its absolute limits. It hurt to breathe and everything ached, but greed was constantly healing him, repairing every torn muscle fiber, stimulating the breakdown and removal of any acids and other byproducts of exercise as he pushed himself so he didn't have to stop. Until they got through the exit, his body was nothing more than a machine designed to move. A small part of him cursed himself for never doing anything to train his agility stat as something new caught his eye as he went towards their final destination. A single ball of fire hung in the air and began to move, seemingly randomly at first, but as the seconds rolled by it became obvious it was going in his direction. For the time it wasn't a major worry, but he knew that as with any other part of the trial, it would grow into one. He was currently faster than it, leaving it in the dust as he pushed himself, but he didn't know how much longer that would be before its own speed grew, and as he found more and more popping into existence around him, it only became a bigger concern with each passing second. It was as he was trying to figure out how to deal with them that he was caught in another pillar of flame, this one bigger than any other, as one of his minds reacted immediately, lowering the water enchantment as far as it could go as he made his way out of it. His eyes almost closed to protect them from the blinding light of the inferno. Where the first time took seconds, the second took minutes, making him question if there was going to be any getting out of it at all. If perhaps the entire trial had burst into flames as he began to feel the cooling effect lose out to the growing heat. It was only as he felt the air begin to burn his lungs that he got through it, with his final destination in sight. By this point the trial as a whole had gotten so hot that his various enchantments couldn't keep him from sweating in his armor while his back began to burn, telling him all he needed to know about how far he was from the chasing balls of fire, but the ending was almost within reach. At least it had been briefly. He'd been able to make out the exit with certainty, not as a light off in the distance but now as a glowing hole in space for him to pass through, maybe 10 more minutes away before it was consumed by a pillar of flame bigger than any other. Damn! Is it still in there? Do I need to find it while it's in there, or would the exit be moved? If it's been moved, I'm not finding it at this point, so I need to trust that if I go in I'll get it. No other option. Greed. I don't care how you destroy my body to do it. I need more speed. He yelled out, feeling the skin on his back blister as the following balls of fire forced their way past the barrier he had set up to touch the metal of the armor itself. For his part, greed didn't question him, instead flooding him with life mana as the spell was activated, giving Ben the speed he wanted as he made it to the edge of the pillar of fire and threw himself into it. Hotter than any yet, it served as a distraction for Ben from the severe pain his legs were in from the spell as the muscle tore itself apart to move him faster. All he could do was go straight, knowing that as long as his course was correct he'd make it through. With the size of the flame pillar bigger than any other he'd seen, he spent many painful minutes doing nothing but running, barely able to breathe as the fire consumed all of the air around them, but pushing through his lightheadedness until suddenly it was gone. They were on the other side after finishing that section of the trial, and he quickly stripped off the armor before he paid the price for Greed's spell and let himself lay down on the ground. I still wouldn't say no to pain resistance, he muttered, hoping the system would feel generous enough to eventually take him up on that suggestion. After he was completely healed, the fact that he'd learned how to get the trial to provide him with more food was a godsend. All of the cooked skin had been shed off in the process, and while that could be saved to give Greed plenty to eat regardless of how the crab felt about it, that meant his body had to cannibalize itself in the healing process. It was as he was stuffing his face with the garbage bread-like substance the trial saw fit to provide that he continued to chip away at training his material user skill. Unfortunately, the trial hadn't provided them with anything worthwhile this time for one sad fact. Everything that had been sitting in a pile that they hadn't already seen was burnt to the point of uselessness. He could take advantage of the metals he saw, but he could only assume the dust that was piled up had been any fabrics that had been there, and he quickly merged them into a single ball to keep them from getting everywhere as they went to the next section. Instead, he was testing a few different things to see what would work. He'd already learned that his magic seemed to be useless on living things, as well as having some unknown boundary between what was alive and what wasn't. Hair and nails, for example, he thought would be possible to manipulate, even while they were still attached to his body. As far as he knew, they were dead. But his magic had no effect till the second they were plucked or clipped. But destruction works on them fine, even when it's still attached, so the two don't work in the same way. He didn't understand the logic behind it and didn't know what to think. His only working theory on the matter was that since his body was technically completely different from the one he was using on Earth, it was possible that neither of those parts were actually dead. It was also possible that they had his mana or spirit in them or something else along those lines that made them be treated as if they were alive right up until they were removed, but in the end he marked it all down as irrelevant for the time being. It didn't work, that was all that mattered. More interesting was a few of the applications he'd found that could be taken advantage of. If he grabbed chunks of both iron and bronze and ran his mana through them to change their consistency, he was able to treat both like clay, and was able to blend them together in a way that he normally never could without heat and a forge. The same could be done using a metal and a few of his removed hair or nail clippings, showing him something incredible. Normally when he made something, he'd need to carefully grind and add any monster or plant materials he wanted to use, and in the end, their structure would still always end up at least a little damaged from the heat. Not so doing this. He didn't think he'd ever give up using the forge completely, but this was showing to be a way he could supplement and enhance his work in the future, and he couldn't wait to put it to the test. Then there was an area he was currently failing at, but believed would be possible as his level and skill increased. Separating two different materials from one another. He didn't see any reason he couldn't, other than his lack of practice and skill, but it was something for him to work on at least a little bit with each level he'd get. If nothing came of it, then it was fine, but if he could make it work, he could imagine numerous uses, all of which he would be happy to put into practice as he did. Then there was the final application. One he couldn't help but find to be the least helpful overall, but it was challenging enough to make good training for him. Holding an ice cube. It might not have sounded like much, but ice was the only material he could create that wanted to change its state by itself without his intervention, all the more so as it sat in his hand. The thing that made it a challenge was keeping it from doing just that. He ran his mana through it to keep it in the shape it was in, not letting a drop of water run down it as he did until he had something absolutely peculiar. A room-temperature piece of ice. The moment he couldn't hold it with his mana anymore, it turned to water in seconds. But he couldn't deny how interesting he found it as he wondered if there could be any applications for such a thing. The only way I see that working is if I attach a mana crystal to it to provide the power and then build my enchantment with my magic to hold it in place. But as for if I'll ever have a reason to do that, well, less expected things have happened. I'll keep the idea in my back pocket for now. Score! He muttered to himself happily as he checked the condition of his body. In the week since they'd finished the last section of the trial, Ben had been letting himself heal naturally from as many of the wounds he'd received as safely as he could. He wanted his healing enhancement to level up, and it never would if he kept getting Greed to cover all of it without giving his body any time to do it itself, but by now he was feeling mostly normal. It was a little surprising for him. Most Tier 1 skills seemed to improve things by about 5% per level depending on what they were, and he was sure the same was true for that one. He'd have thought it would have taken him another week or two until he remembered the skill that had landed him in trouble not too long before. Partial demonic body. As much as it annoyed his god that he had it, he couldn't help but feel the benefit. As a skill that supposedly made him heal faster and gave him an enhanced immunity to both poisons and illness, he hadn't had any chance to see just how effective it was at those things since he got it as a result of living with two healers, but now he was seeing just how useful it could be, and all the more so with it paired with healing enhancement. Of course, it could also be related to the rapid rise of my vitality attributes. Still not sure where its effects on my life force ends and the ones on my body begins, but either way I'll be getting plenty of use out of everything now, it looks like. When his resistance enhancement leveled up, that meant healing him was going to become harder for greed, as well as being buffed. Ben was already feeling a weakening effect from it, which was more than a little worrying. He needed every bit he could get for them to survive, as well as for when he placed his own enchantments on the trial. Of course, on the opposite end of things, it might be weakening the effects of the trial on me as well. All we can do is wait and see. I'm pretty sure I'd need to have it at the 4th level to not be able to stop the countdown anymore. But by then hopefully I'll have improved the enchantment further, so let's just wait and see how it goes. You think you're about ready, Greed? As I can be, the crab replied as Ben put on his armor. How bad do you think this section's going to be? I mean, it's the light magic section, so who knows? This should be way closer to your specialty than mine. He had his ideas and concerns, but the only way to know for sure was to step through, and with few preparations that could be made they stepped through the door to whatever they'd face. Along with the enchantment on it, the armor itself had been modified for the next section, with holes put in place for Greed to see out of it as well. Given that he was a light and life mage before the skill awakened to blessing magic, they both deemed it best for him to be able to see what was going on this time. But as Ben looked around and felt a huge grin stretch across his face, he thought that might have been a pointless consideration, even as he chastised himself for underestimating what he was seeing after all they'd gone through. This is a trap. This has to be a trap. He muttered to himself as the same scene that gave him hope was making Greed swear up a storm. Of course it's a trap. Look at it. Assface didn't get merciful on us all of a sudden and decide to give us a million freaking exits out. All around them were the same doors they'd seen to get out of every other section of the trial, stretching on seemingly forever. It was clearly an aspect of the illusions that light magic could create and was enough to cause anyone worry, at least if they were all seeing the same thing. Greed. I need you to be exact here. What are you seeing? Like I said, a million freaking exits. Why? Do you see something different? Well, if you can't see that all but one are see-through with pits in the ground and things overhead most of them, then I'd say yeah, we're seeing pretty different things here. How sure are you this isn't a trick? That it's not showing you something slightly different, it's showing me. I don't want to say certain because I've already seen this god can do things with magic I'd never expect. But I'm almost certain that that's an application of dark magic. Light can't do the same. We have nothing else to go off of, man. We have to take the plunge and hope. Infinite hells. Fine, go do it. Ben confidently walked the expanse, avoiding anywhere he was sure he saw something until he was at the only trial he thought he didn't. Unlike the others, he couldn't see through it, nor could he see any traps around it either. Still, he chose to be cautious, taking a hesitant step as he did, fully prepared to throw himself backwards if need be. But nothing happened. They made it through the gate to the other side, only a few minutes after that section had started and before they could see whatever else the trial was going to throw at them. They were safe. It took a moment to sink in, but when it did they were screaming with joy, neither able to contain their enthusiasm. Damn it! Ben yelled out as he threw his arms into the air. Even you didn't completely account for my overwhelming resistances. Never met a mortal like this, have you? While a small part of him insisted on pointing out that his resistances stopped doing much in each section as the challenge grew, he violently shoved the thought to the side. This was a true victory against a god he was growing to despise. He was going to focus on the win in front of him for at least a little bit. All right, Greed, all you have to do is think of something and we'll see if it works, Ben told his companion, a metal box strapped to his head in preparation for a little experiment he'd made to keep himself sane. Like this? He asked in a robotic voice only to change his tone immediately. Holy crap! This thing actually works? You're crazy, Legs. How did you come up with this? Just saw a need and decided to fill it. Not that it's any good in here. What Ben had made shared properties with some of his mind control devices, as well as music players he'd made in the past. A small tool that read the user's mind, speaking the thoughts it contained aloud, even if it did come off as rather metallic as a result. It hadn't been easy to make by any stretch, but after everything else he'd been doing, he needed to stretch his creativity, at least a little bit. With that experiment done though, they got back to what they were normally doing during their imprisonment. Ben training his skills and trying to learn all he could to keep them alive, and Greed either sleeping through what he could, buffing Ben, or practicing his music, at least until he needed a snack. Ben stopped what he was doing to eat what the trial provided him as well before cutting his hand for the crab, as they both had their fill, neither talking during the time. It was a complicated matter for the both of them, but it had to be done to keep them alive. Legs, tell me something interesting, Greed asked after feasting on Ben's blood. What? Where did that come from? It came from my boredom. You might be able to keep yourself entertained staring at a wall and training your skills, but I need a bit more stimulation. Come on, help a guy out. Ben thought in silence for a minute before he spoke up. Well, there's only one skill it's impossible to enchant with. I don't know why I expected anything else at this point, but fine, I'll bite. What skill? Magic nullification. An extremely good enchanter might be able to create an item to hold its effects for a few hours, but in the end it always decays away and destroys itself, or at least I've read. I'd say that's pretty interesting. I mean, kind of. But come on, you've got to have something better than that for me. I don't know, man. I'll think on it and get back to you later. If you're looking to be distracted, why not tell me what you're gonna do when we get out of here? If we get out. When we get out, Ben told him firmly. Power of positive thinking. We're not being defeatists when we need to put our all into this. Fine, in that case, I'm making this ordeal the center of my performance from now on. I'm going to compose a song so incredible that bards across the land will have to sing it as well. Just you wait, Legs, you're going to be a star. Can I decline? Nope. You told me to be optimistic. I can't be much more than thinking about how rich surviving is going to make me. That's for sure. How about you? What are your dreams once we see the sun? God. First things first, I want a real meal. Even if it's not killing me, man wasn't meant to live on bread alone. Especially not this crap. Other than that, being reunited with my wonderful forge will be incredible. Honestly, I can't wait. I'm gonna use so many things I can't in here and make so much junk. Just you watch, I've made 2 ultra-rare items now. I'm gonna do my best to flood the market. Oh, and I have a couple more skills to try and awaken too. Well, I really only need to manage it with one, but it's gonna be hard to do it stuck in here. I've got to push myself a bit more. Oh, and some payment to collect too. Nobody gets out of it just because they think I'm dead. Wait, go back a bit. You're close to awakening 2 more skills. Well, I've got 2 9th level ones, so I'd say so. Honestly, awakening focus isn't really important. I don't even know what it could do for me if it does. But getting Connect awakened is essential. If I can do that, then I should be able to take my crafting to a whole other level. God, I can only imagine. He was starting to drool as he thought about what he'd be able to make if he could enchant with awakened skills. Just being able to do it with 9th level ones was proving incredible already, but awakened ones would take him to a whole new level. He would even be able to go around adding the magic necessary to make the gates and collect the piles of money that came with such a thing. He knew he'd have to push his limits to make it happen, but the results would be incredible. Alright, I already know by this point that you're ridiculous. What I'm more curious about is if you're still hanging on to that resolve you had before you got tossed in here, if you catch my meaning. After all this, I'm sure talking to Thera will be easy. Ha, well, you'll have to let me know how it goes. When you come to claim your show, that is, the moment we get out, I'm heading for the gate. I don't think I'm ever coming to All Faith again after all this. Ha! Don't blame you. All right, I'll take that, he said to himself as he went to pick up the piece of bread he'd just forced the trial to give him as he waited for his mana to recover. They didn't really need to take a week after how easy the last section had been, but they'd both agreed to give themselves at least that much time between each section. They needed to rest and recover each time, and Ben was determined to work on his skills. He wanted to gain whatever bit of edge he could as they rested, even if it didn't end in a new level for him. It was only once he was back to his maximum mana that he suited up, his armor altered to handle the dark affinity of the next trial by including the dark resistance enhancement from his ring, as well as the purification of light magic and a few other effects to give them whatever edge they could. Given that dark magic was largely mind effects and debuffs, he wasn't looking forward to the trial, no matter how much his resistances might help, but he knew there was no getting around it. This section would be the middle of the trial. Once they finished it, there was less than half to go. All they had to do was their best. With both of them as ready as they'd ever be, they stepped through the door, leaving their safety and finding themselves in complete darkness as they did. Unlike the brief darkness that came any time they left their waiting room to enter whatever section was about to be thrown at them, this one didn't end. They'd found themselves in an endless abyss, a fact that made the soul light source shine out all the brighter to him. Oh, come on, and let this be another easy one, he thought with crossed fingers as he activated a light enchantment on the outside of his armor, eager to get whatever bit of mercy he could as he started walking to it, talking to Greed as he went. What do you think? Feeling anything yet? Don't think so, just wish there was something to see. Not much point in having a light if the world's empty. Huh. Interesting. Greed wasn't wrong. Ben had been expecting the dark at least, but he'd also thought the trial might try similar things as the previous section had, hiding traps and pitfalls while making them hallucinate other exits. The fact that there was none of that, at least yet, made him worry about whatever was to come. Still, he did his best not to focus on what wasn't there, instead moving with cautious speed to what he hoped was the exit. There were only so many things dark magic could do, and he'd done his best to prepare against them. All it came down to was if his luck would hold up. For the first while, it seemed like nothing was happening. They made their way, drawing ever closer to the source of light and freedom. But all at once Ben was overcome by weakness and felt a very real stabbing in his chest as he went, one he wasn't able to shake. Both were far too instantaneous to be the gradual change the trial seemed to provide as it raised the difficulty. And though he'd expected both debuffs and mind effects to come into play eventually, he didn't think he was being affected. The key part being that he wasn't. The stabbing he felt had given way to a feeling of moisture dripping down his chest where Greed was sitting in the armor with him. And with the pain came the feeling of things snapping into place as he connected to the crab to confirm what he'd expected. Kill him killy him howdarethi's asshole legit mainta thiskill him killy him. He broke the connection and wanted to scream. Of course, the only person he had to rely on in the trial had come under a mind effect that drove him into a murderous rage. The buffs on him had been cancelled, leaving him all the weaker as he tried to rush to the distant light, with the crab's claws cutting into his flesh as they went, leaving him to struggle with what to do. Greed had been shoved into there to keep the crab safe with him. But if Ben did nothing, he'd only end up more and more hurt in the hours that were to come as his only companion dug into his flesh. Feeling no other option, he took off the helmet, followed by the chest piece Greed sat in, fully intending to put them back on but feeling the weight of the item skyrocket the moment it had come off. The purification effect on it had been doing its job, staving off any debuffs the trial had thrown at them, but without it, as well as not having Greed to buff him, it felt like he'd gained a few £100, with the crab doing no better. His companion was still in his fit of madness but snapping much weaker now, not able to work up the strength to do any real harm. But for all the good that did him, they had been put into a terrible spot. He had been sure that even with Greed's buffs and his armor that they were hours away. Now that he had none of that, he couldn't begin to guess how long it would take. He stared off into the distant light, seeing his target and sighing as he picked up a very heavy Greed as the crab tried to struggle. If his journey had just gotten longer, then there was no point lounging, so he began his walk again. 58, 59, 60. Damn. As time wore on, whatever debuffs had been placed on them had only grown stronger, until Ben had reached the point that he was dragging himself across the ground to get to where they needed to go. Greed placed upon his back, with his companion no longer having the strength to struggle as all of his power was sapped. A small part of him wondered if the crab had died, but he was placed on the back of his jacket so he couldn't connect to him through it, the effort it would take to move his hand back to check being too great when he needed to focus on getting to the exit. He didn't think he'd ever felt so powerless before, as if he didn't even have the attributes necessary to handle the weight of his own body, and all the worse was how long he'd been in there. A single mind was being used to count the seconds, something he'd started after he'd taken off the armor to keep track of things. But he was regretting it. He'd just passed 24 hours in that section since he'd been keeping track. And given the fact that the rest areas had time limits, he was willing to bet the trial sections did as well. He didn't want to be stuck there to find out he was right. In one bit of luck for him, he'd never ended up succumbing to a mental effect, though he wasn't sure why. From the impression he got of the god who'd made the trial, having him and Greed kill each other in the middle of it was right up that bastard's alley. But that impulse had only struck one of them in the end as the exit came into sight. No longer a distant light, he could now make it out as a door to go through, and it renewed his vigor as he forced himself onward, dragging his body across the ground with bleeding fingers as he did everything he could to keep from stopping, all the while feeling the debuffs continue to grow. I can't stop. I stop, I die. Any bit of rest I take is just more time for the trial to raise the difficulty. The fact that I can still move at all is basically a miracle. As long as Greed's alive, whatever damage I do to myself getting out can be fixed. Even if he's not alive, I'll figure something out. I just need to keep going. He kept pushing and motivating himself, doing everything he could to tell himself to keep moving. He felt his legs bleeding from dragging them against the ground for so long, the skin all but worn away, but he wouldn't stop as the exit grew larger and larger within his view, even as he grew more and more lightheaded as he went. Can't believe I'm suffering from blood loss in a place where there wasn't even any direct harm. He thought with mirth. Well, I guess getting Greed to attack me counts as harm, but at least that stopped bleeding after a while on its own. Though it might have started again. Damn. All of his minds were cursing the god of the trial, as well as the gods of the world for letting it be placed there so easily. Every part of him was screaming that it needed to be destroyed but knew it wouldn't happen while he was still inside of it, and as he finally made it to the exit, all but rolling through it, he decided that figuring out how to do that was just as important as anything else he was filling his time with and would shoot to the top of his priority list the second he was free. The moment they passed through the boundary of the trial, all effects they were under vanished. Even injured and in pain, Ben felt incredible in comparison, vowing to never take for granted his body again as Greed came back to his senses. Damn! My head. Legs, you okay? He asked, filled with concern. Didn't hurt you too bad, did I? I'll live, but man are those things sharp, Ben said as he laid down, letting Greed start to treat him. On the plus side, if it's 11 sections, then we just passed the halfway mark, so that's something. I wouldn't call 5 more sections of that anything positive to look towards, Greed said with a shake of his head before suddenly turning sheepish. Though it looks like we both just got a bit of good news. What's up? My magic leveled up and I completed my job. Let me borrow that crystal of yours. Oh, freaking sweet, he said happily as he handed it over. An increase to Greed's magic meant an increase to their long-term chances of survival, made all the better considering that Ben was only growing more immune to it with every level his resistance skill got. The fact that Greed was getting a level to an awakened magic would more than offset that. He watched as the crab looked at his options, weighing them as he did. Hey, what do you think I should focus on more? Buffs or healing? Both are really important, so I'm fine no matter what you decide. It's not like you won't get plenty of practice from both choices. True, since I'm not much of a healer outside of here, I suppose I'll take Lord of Buffs. With that selection made, Ben took the crystal back and let himself relax for a few minutes before getting up to stop the trial's countdown. There was a lot to do. He needed to make sure they had the time to do all of it. Oh, that's really not good, Ben said as he got up and looked around. Gods, what now? The trial didn't spit out the armor I'd left. When he'd taken it off and realized he didn't have the strength to handle it after that, he'd left it, believing it would show up in the piles of items that they kept finding between sections, but no such luck that time. Unlike the last time, there actually were a few items to be had, all from the dead god's race, but none had the magic materials he craved to power his enchantments. So that means I need to remake my armor without a power source? I mean, I guess me and Greed could provide it, but that's going to be rough. But what else can I? His thoughts trailed off as he considered another option. There was one more power source he had at his fingertips that didn't rely on someone dying and leaving something good. There was his rainbow mana job crystal, and his cursed ring made with Morabugel to extract from it. Okay, there's an idea, but I still need to make a new set of armor first. I really should try to think of a better way of doing it too, because it's pretty far from quick. Let's see. Should I actually make that forge like I was thinking? I mean, it would be plenty handy, so it's possible, but I should also make a way to use my magic more efficiently too. A staff would be a little unwieldy considering how I use it, but I am a mage of sorts now, so being able to channel my magic more efficiently could only be useful, especially considering the fact that it's non-affinitied. Maybe make a hammer to act as a staff? It would be handy for smithing, but flexibility is important too. As options filled his head, he went through the various items left by past trial participants, trying to see just what he could put to use. I hate this. You can heal yourself, it's fine. Besides, I don't even need that much of your shell. This is a major trauma of mine legs. You don't know what it's like to almost be eaten. Not only is that exceptionally not true, I'm being eaten by you each day. Besides, I'm not trying to eat you. I just need to chip off a few pieces to use. Your kind were hunted because the living ruby is handy for mana conducting, right? Just give me a bit, so I can keep on keeping us alive. Ugh, fine, take what you need. Greed gave in, turning his back to Ben to let him carefully chisel away a few flecks here and there as he healed himself, feeding on Ben's blood to make up for what his body was cannibalizing, only so Ben could take more. It wasn't a quick process. It took hours of chipping and feeding until Ben got all he needed, with Greed yelling out as he did. What the hell is blood thinning? Did you just get that? Ben asked with interest as he gathered up all of the shell shards. Cool, I thought that was a purely vampiric skill, but I guess anyone can get it so long as they drink enough blood. Good to know. Not good to know. What am I supposed to say if anyone sees I have it? Just say you're an 8th vampire on your mom's side or something, it's fine. Now that I have everything I need, I'm getting to work. He'd already condensed the ruby shell fragments into a ball, but from there he got the other two materials he planned on using, steel and cloth. From his testing, he already knew that he could use his magic on fabrics to condense them to one solid lump, almost woody in character, but so long as it was stretched out thin enough after it would return to its more flexible structure. Since metal also had plenty of bend and give to it so long as it was a thin enough wire, that meant it was only the ruby that lacked that property, something he hoped to change as he filled all three materials with his mana and began kneading them together. It didn't take long until it was a homogeneous blend, and after only a bit of time waiting for his mana to regenerate, he moved on to the next bit. Slowly and carefully, he used his hands and magic to pull at the new reddish stone out until it formed a thread. It wasn't quick by any means. He constantly needed to check that everything was uniform during the process while also doing his best to ensure he didn't break it either, but by the time he was done he could move on to the last and final step, weaving it into a glove. With how long this is going to take, I really hope it works. The idea was simple enough. Most mages would use staves for their magic if they insisted on using a medium for it at all. It let them conduct their power and help both with control and preventing lost mana as they went, but that was mostly when attacking or for any spells at a distance. Since that wasn't how his was used at all, that meant he needed something else. With the solution he'd come to being a glove. He couldn't be sure if it would work until he finished and put it on, so he poured his focus into the task, aiming to be done as fast as he could. It had taken hours of careful work, but by the end he was able to smile down on his brand new glove, eager to test it out. He moved all of his rings to his left hand as the glove went on the right, giving it a few squeezes and finding it comfortable. It didn't feel like it was going to tear or break in any place, nor was it too tight. All that mattered was if it would work. Picking up a piece of metal, he ran his mana through it and immediately felt a difference in the quality of manipulating it. It wasn't that he had been bad before. Even prior to gaining a magic skill, his mana manipulation had been extremely good. But as he bent it and fiddled with it, he couldn't help but notice he was able to go for longer before feeling the effects of mana exhaustion begin to approach, meaning he'd be able to get more practice in as he went, something to be incredibly happy about. With a new tool in hand, he was originally going to immediately start making a forge to create armor with, to have something of a higher quality than what he could hand sculpt with his magic, only to stop as Greed screamed. Gotta say, having someone appear out of nowhere doesn't get less freaky. He yelled out as Quillith showed up to Ben's surprise. Oh hey, has it been a month already? I honestly wasn't expecting to see you again while I was in here. Unless you have anything handy for me, we can put the lesson on hold. But if you want to stay and chat, the company would be nice enough. It wasn't that he and Greed were growing sick of each other so much as it was that there was only so much for them to talk about, but given the opportunity for someone else to entertain them, they were both ready to jump at the option as the alien shook his head. I don't have that much time. Unfortunately, my superiors have you labeled as a lost cause while you remain in the trial, so before I couldn't visit again, I wanted to confirm that there was nothing you wanted me to tell the outside world on your behalf. I think I got everything I needed to already, Greed told him, disappointed that he wasn't getting a bit more entertainment as Ben stood there and thought before shaking his head. No, I think I'm good. Thanks though, I appreciate it. He thought that would be the end of it, but the alien remained. So he simply stared back, waiting to see what it had to say. Your friend is struggling without you. What? You mean Thera? Is she okay? What are you talking about? He asked, suddenly feeling a sense of urgency to go through the next section and all the others without waiting. Nothing bad, so relax. She's simply taking your loss hard. Even if that skill you share lets her know you're still alive. Are you sure there's nothing you want me to tell her for you? He felt himself relax knowing that she wasn't in trouble, but didn't know what to do with that information. It felt like anything he could say would be nothing but false hope. Did he have any right to give her that? If he died, then it might hurt all the more for it. No, I said I need to stay positive. I will get out of here, I want her to know that. All right. I guess there is one thing I want you to tell her for me if you would. You ready, Greed? Ben asked as he put on his last piece of armor. A piece of his rainbow mana crystal embedded into it to give it far more power than the white mana crystal he'd used before ever could. As I'll ever be. Cool. Then let's do this, he said as positively as he could before stepping into the space section of the trial. Thera felt her face stretch into a deeper frown as the notifications filled her mind. But she reminded herself to breathe and ignore it as she fiddled with her necklace. She'd known for ages that training her dark magic had the chance to raise the level of her charm as well. Even if she didn't like it, she wasn't going to stop her training. It was the only escape she had from her thoughts as she sat above the carnage below her, staring at the unending herds of beasts that were killing each other in the name of her practice. What's it even matter right now? I just need to work on my magic and ignore how long it's. I just need to work on my magic. With every day Ben didn't leave the trial, she found herself in a worse state. She'd known that some could take around a month to complete, but those were on the far rarer end of the spectrum. The fact that he wasn't out yet ate at her more and more, stroking her worry if she ever let herself think about it. After all, just because he was still alive didn't mean he could escape. Instead, she went to focusing on her life magic now that those three had leveled up, feeling the boost to her overall control as she did. There were plenty of animals at a clear disadvantage in the battle royal going on beneath her, and as long as it wasn't one that could be eaten in a single bite, she could work her mana in a number of ways, healing the wounds she saw being created as quickly as she could, raising their strength and speed at the long-term cost of their bodies, and even making their attacks more dangerous if it had something she could help stimulate the production of, like a natural poison. Even then, though, there were some creatures that were simply too powerful, even with any assistance to the weaker ones, such as the All-Seer below her that was in the middle of slaughtering everything else. Just seeing it made her angry, bringing back memories of Roan and the first time she'd almost had to watch Ben die. The one being driven to madness by her dark magic seemed far more powerful than the one in her memory, but it also proved to be the perfect creature to take her frustrations out on as she tried to decide just what to do to it. Ultimately, she decided to strike it at its greatest strength, the dozens of eyes on its face. She directed her life mana to them one after another, bending her spell to fit her will as she conducted an imperfect healing response again and again. Unlike any time she'd usually heal something where the wound would typically return to its state before any damage had occurred, at least so long as it was something she knew how to fix, this was meant to be flawed. Any damage was repaired poorly and layers of new cells built up over what was already there. And slowly but surely the beast began to understand what was happening as it was left blinded and panicked as the other creatures around took the chance for their revenge. Well, I guess I'm done for the day, she thought. Now that there was no concern that she might miss out on the chance to raise her life magic with her earth magic, she wielded it liberally, raising spikes from the earth to impale the remaining creatures before going back to the gate to get a new job. Available jobs: Queen of Mana, Musician, Professional Dancer, Bard, Darkness Mage Charm Specialized, Healer, Telekinetic Mage, Dark Mage, Adventurer, High Spirit Mage. MMH, I'm really starting to run low on options. As long as I awaken my magics it won't be a problem, but maybe I should try and get 1 or 2 more skills to give me some more, just in case. Well, that's not important now, what matters is what I'll pick. As much as she wanted to try to awaken her skills, she wasn't sure if taking High Spirit Mage would help, at least not immediately. When she'd taken its precursor she'd instantly leveled up all of her affinityed magics. But given that she'd just leveled most of them that very day before completing her job, the chances of that happening again seemed small. It would be much better to take something else in the meantime that she could finish reasonably quickly while still training her magics, and then hope that if she took it as her next job after it would be able to raise them, or at least make it easier for her to cross the boundary that was a 9th level skill to a 0th level awakened skill. And if I'm going to do that, then I guess I should take the only magic job that the Spirit Mage branch doesn't affect. I'll take Telekinetic Mage. Name Thera Oris. Race: Succubus/Spirit Hybrid. Titles: Spirit Child. Jobs: Telekinetic Mage, LV0. Previous jobs: Beginner Dancer, Dancer, Apprentice Mage, Earth Mage, True Mage, High Earth Mage, Spirit Mage, Life Mage, High Life Mage. Attributes: A Vitality, 1075. A Vitality Recovery Rate, 12 per hour. Mana, 262009. Mana Recovery Rate, 60 per minute. Strength, 129. Agility, 375. Stamina, 310. Intelligence, 322. Affinities: A Light, 4. Life 22. Fire 11. Water 14. Air 12. Earth 103. Death 3. Dark 43. Space 2. Time 1. Resistances: A Light 5. Life 9. Fire 11. Water 16. Air 12. Earth 35. Death 13. Dark 42. Space 7. Time 8. Blessed Skills: Earth Magic LV9. Charm Magic LV3. Passive Skills: World Speak Plus. Coordination LV3. A Medical Knowledge LV4. A Bind. Active Skills: Calculate LV1. Dance LV4. The String Instrument LV3. A Woodwind Instrument LV2. Cleaning LV1. Staff Wielder LV0. Meditation LV2. Speed Reading LV3. Life Magic LV9. Telekinesis LV4. Dark Magic LV4. Spirit Empowering LV3. Cooking LV0. Blessings: Analia's Blessing. Trials: Trial of Analia and Talona. With that done she went to leave, returning to the embassy she'd been staying at to get whatever bit of sleep she could, but only after taking a detour to walk by the trial. Her father was still there, standing guard to keep her from trying anything even if she knew that there was no point now. While there had been a slim hope she could have met up with him before, at this point she knew it would be pointless. Either he was progressing through the trial or he'd found somewhere to hide within it. She couldn't know more than that. Seeing no change to it like any time she'd walk by, she ignored her father and went to head back to her room, finding 2 people waiting for her as she did. Once again Steph and Will were there, looking much better than the last time, even if she was only feeling worse. She never did end up visiting them as she said she would, instead throwing herself into her magic. But Steph's bright smile didn't seem to carry any blame as she waved to her, filled with enthusiasm. "Hey Thera, are you busy right now?" she yelled out, making her wonder if she should just walk past and go to bed, but stopped herself. Shutting herself away wouldn't do any good, and spending time with someone might help with the loneliness she couldn't escape. "No, what's up?" She was led to the home of Jake, Amy, and Yuzu, with the 3 of them already waiting, a table of food and drinks prepared and a festive attitude amongst them. It didn't match how she was feeling at all. But as she took off her cloak, she at least tried to hide it to keep the mood from going down as she looked to Steph. What's going on? Celebration of life, she said, not giving any more context as she was given a seat next to Yuzu and taking it as some sort of human party. We're just here to talk about Ben. And what a maniac he was, Jake said with a laugh. That one sculpture he did in school gave me nightmares for a week. Ha, he always hated how that became the first thing people thought of when they saw him, Will said as he smiled. He was always going on about how he'd made so many cheerful and nice things too, but people only focused on the one time he made something that matched whatever theme he was assigned. God, what was it again? Despair? Steph chimed in, shaking her head as she remembered it. I'll never forget that. He managed to win a prize for it and get called to talk to the principal at the same time because of its content. He was annoyed about it for days. Speaking of, did he actually lecture the principal when that happened? Amy wanted to know. I remember the rumors going around. But he totally did. Will cut her off, holding his stomach and cackling as he remembered it. I'm pretty sure only 10 of the minutes he was in there was the principal talking to him, while the next hour was Ben giving him a lesson on art history he would never forget. He really was an outrageous guy. Wait, that's what happened? Jake asked. I'm pretty sure he missed science class doing that then. Me and a couple other guys thought he was getting torn into, not the other way around. I wouldn't be shocked if he planned that, Steph told them. He was absolutely the sort of person who'd rather talk about his interests than be forced to sit down in a class he didn't care about. Honestly, it was impossible to get him to focus on anything if it couldn't catch his interest. I'm just glad he was passing. The conversation went on, but as they talked more and more while Thera sat and listened, she was able to pick up on just what she wasn't liking about it all. Each of them was talking about Ben in the past tense, and what they were really doing snapped into place. So this is a funeral, she said sharply as she got up and put her cloak on to leave, not wanting to be around them a minute longer. Have fun with that, but I'm not going to just sit here and act like Ben is dead. The mood of everyone else instantly sunk while Jake took the initiative to try and calm her down before she stormed off. Hey Thera, we all want to believe Ben's alive, but I don't have some stupid belief he's alive. I have a skill telling me he is. If you all want to give up on him, then do it yourselves, she yelled, not giving them time to respond as she stormed off, leaving them in silence. It was Amy who broke it, the obvious question coming to her mind. Does she really have a skill that would let her know if Ben died? She does, Will told her, holding his face. Neither he nor Steph had even considered that fact, but if he had died then it would have switched to its inactive mode. If she could still feel him, then he was still alive, trapped in the trial. I mean, it's been a month now, right? Jake asked hesitantly. If he's still alive and he's still in there, is he? He trailed off, not knowing what to say. None of them did. The positive mood they felt before disappeared as they all sat alone with their thoughts. Stupid. I shouldn't have even gone with them. Dumb idiots just completely giving up on Ben and treating him like he's already dead. What a waste of time. Thera curled up in her bed, her thoughts a tangled mess of emotions as she laid there feeling worse than usual. Even if she knew he was alive, he wasn't there with her. The only place she wanted him to be. She knew she wasn't in a good place emotionally, but there was nothing she could do to change that. She hated the feeling of loss, of powerlessness. It just made her want to lash out, but knew it would be pointless if she did. All she could do was try to get what little sleep she could as forced her eyes closed. Why did I even worry so much about the future if I'm just going to feel like this now? Excuse me, a voice said in her room, making her snap her eyes open as she heard it and quickly gathered the dark mana within her to attack whoever it was, seeing a Gray standing by the window. He looked at her defensive stance, her hand outstretched, and shook his head. I'm not really here, so don't waste the energy. I believe Ben has talked about me before. My name is Quillith. She lowered her hand but continued to gather her dark mana in the event he was lying, trying to prepare for the worst. What do you want? I'm not sure how much you understand about how my kind interact with your reality, but I visited Ben within the trial. I am simply here to pass on a message while I can. Wait, you've seen him? Is he okay? Is he alive? He's as okay as he can be, the Gray said hesitantly. Having agreed with him has significantly increased his survival odds, and we believe he's past the halfway point of the trial. Unfortunately, I don't have long. I'm simply here to tell you that he says he hasn't given up yet. I hope that can help give you whatever comfort you need. Before she could say another word, he vanished, leaving her alone again with only that. You haven't given up yet? Of course you haven't, you idiot. I don't think I've ever seen you give up in the face of danger, even when you probably should. Still, just having something beyond her skill to confirm he was alive gave her hope, and for the first night in weeks let her sleep a little easier.